A standard brick in ancient Egypt measured approximately 22 centimeters in length, 16 centimeters wide, and 8 centimeters thick. That was the average dimension across most construction projects, though the exact size shifted slightly depending on the reign of the particular ruler in power at the time. Builders had a general template they followed, but regional variations meant bricks from one part of the Nile Valley could be a fraction of a centimeter different from bricks made further upstream. The consistency was remarkable for a civilization working with mud and straw. The royal cubit was the primary unit of length, and it measured somewhere between 52.3 and 52.5 centimeters. This was the standard for monumental architecture and royal construction projects. There was also a shorter cubit used for everyday building, measuring 45 centimeters exactly, which meant craftsmen had to be careful which cubit they were referencing. A difference of 7.5 centimeters could throw off an entire wall if someone grabbed the wrong measuring stick. Scribes used a grain measurement system called the hekat, and they divided it into very small fractions using a specific set of units. The system allowed divisions down to 1/64th of a hekat, which was a level of precision that seems excessive for measuring grain. They would track these tiny amounts in their accounting, recording deliveries and distributions with mathematical care. The fractions were represented by specific marks that formed a recognizable pattern across administrative documents. The Nilometer was a structure built along the riverbank with graduated markings to measure the water level during the flood season. A reading of 16 cubits was considered the ideal height for a good agricultural year, providing enough water for crops without causing destructive flooding. When the water reached that specific mark, farmers knew the coming season would be productive. Readings above or below that number signaled potential hardship, and the records of these measurements were kept for generations. Surveyors used a measuring rope with knots tied at regular intervals to re-establish field boundaries after the annual flood erased all visible markers. The rope was stretched across the land, and the knots served as reference points for determining property lines. This practice was essential because the floodwaters obliterated fences and stone markers every year, making it impossible to know where one field ended and another began without the rope system. The surveyors became essential figures in the community. The unit of area called the ta was roughly equivalent to 2,735 square meters, and it was used for calculating the size of agricultural plots. Landowners would pay taxes based on how many ta they controlled, so accurate measurement was critical for both the farmer and the treasury. The tax collectors would arrive with their measuring ropes and their records, and disputes over a fraction of a ta could become lengthy administrative matters. The deben was a unit of weight used for metals, weighing approximately 91 grams, though its exact value fluctuated depending on what material was being weighed. Gold had a different deben value than copper, and the system made trade more complicated than a simple standard weight. Merchants had to know which deben was being used for each transaction, and the records often specified the material to avoid confusion. The fluctuating values meant that a deben of gold was worth far more than a deben of copper. Mathematical papyri from the period show problems involving the calculation of cylindrical granaries, and the scribes used a formula that approximated pi as 3.16. This value is close to the actual mathematical constant, but slightly off, which would have introduced minor errors in large volume calculations. The scribes were practical mathematicians, solving real storage problems, and their approximation was accurate enough for government work. They were not trying to be mathematically precise in the modern sense. The counting system was base 10, similar to the system used today, but they had separate hieroglyphs for each power of 10. There was a specific symbol for 1, another for 10, another for 100, and so on up to 1 million. The million symbol was a figure of a man with his hands raised in astonishment, which conveys a sense of how large that number seemed. Writing large numbers required repeating these symbols many times, which made lengthy records somewhat cumbersome. The shore was a unit of length used specifically for measuring rope and cordage, not for measuring distance in the way the cubit was used. This specialized unit suggests that rope was important enough in Egyptian society to deserve its own measurement system. Ships, construction, and agriculture all relied on rope, and having a standard way to measure it made production and trade more efficient. The rope makers would have known exactly how long a shore was. The standard brick size was derived from the royal cubit, but different periods produced slightly different dimensions. Builders in the Old Kingdom used one size, while builders in the New Kingdom used another, and the differences are visible in the archaeological record. A trained eye can identify the approximate construction date of a mud brick wall simply by measuring the bricks. The variation was small enough that it didn't affect structural integrity, but significant enough to be noticed by modern researchers. The term sedat was used for measuring large tracts of land, and one sedat was equal to a square with sides of 100 royal cubits. This was a substantial area, used for estates and major agricultural holdings. The calculation was straightforward. Multiply 100 cubits by 100 cubits and you had your setat. The system was efficient for large-scale land management. The hin was a unit of volume for liquids, approximately 0.48 liters, and it was used for measuring oil, beer, and other fluids. This small unit allowed for precise measurement of liquid commodities, which was important for trade and taxation. The records show transactions involving fractions of a hin, indicating that even small amounts of liquid were tracked carefully. The system was practical for everyday commerce. The measuring rope used by surveyors was made of twisted plant fibers, and the knots were tied at intervals of 1 royal cubit. The surveyors would stretch the rope between 2 points, count the knots, and record the distance in cubits. This method was simple but effective, and it remained in use for thousands of years. The rope would stretch over time, so the surveyors had to replace them periodically to maintain accuracy. The Nilometer at Elephantine Island was one of the most important measurement stations, and its readings were used to predict the flood levels for the entire country. Priests would observe the water level and announce the expected flood height, which determined the tax rate for the coming year. A high flood meant more available land for farming, while a low flood meant less. The readings were recorded on the stone walls of the Nilometer structure. The calculation of granary volumes used a formula that treated the granary as a cylinder with a flat bottom and a domed top. The scribes would measure the diameter and the height, then apply their approximation of pi to find the volume. This allowed them to determine how much grain could be stored in a given structure, which was essential for managing the national food supply. The formula was written on papyrus and taught to scribes as part of their training. The hieroglyph for 1 million showed a man with his arms raised, and this symbol appeared in inscriptions recording large quantities of goods. The image was meant to represent someone overwhelmed by the number, which gives a human dimension to an otherwise abstract concept. The scribes would use this symbol when they needed to express vast amounts of anything, from grain to cattle to years. The ta measurement was originally based on the amount of land a pair of oxen could plow in a day, which made it a practical unit tied to agricultural reality. A ta was thus both a measurement of area and a measurement of labor, linking the land to the work required to cultivate it. This dual meaning made the unit immediately understandable to farmers and officials alike. The Deben weight for gold was slightly different than the Deben weight for copper, and the records specified the material to avoid confusion in trade. A merchant selling gold would use the gold Deben, while someone selling copper would use the copper standard. The difference was small enough that casual observation wouldn't notice, but large transactions could be affected significantly. The system required careful record-keeping. The surveyor's rope was typically 100 royal cubits long, and it was called a cord of measure in the administrative texts. This length was practical for measuring fields because it allowed the surveyors to cover a large distance without needing to reposition the rope too many times. The 100-cubit rope became a standard tool, and the surveyors would carry it with them on their rounds. The mathematical papyri show problems involving the calculation of the slope of a pyramid, using the seked system that measured horizontal distance per vertical cubit. The slope was expressed as a ratio, and the builders used these calculations to ensure the sides of their structures remained uniform. A slight error in the second could produce a visible deviation in the finished building. The scribes and builders worked together to achieve the required precision. The hin was often used to measure beer, which was a standard beverage consumed by all levels of society. The workers building the pyramids received a daily ration of beer as part of their payment, and the amount was measured in hins. The records show that the standard ration was about 2 hins per day for a laborer, which is roughly 1 liter of beer daily. This was considered adequate for sustaining them through a day of hard labor. The granary calculations also accounted for losses due to spoilage and pests, which meant the actual storage capacity was slightly less than the calculated volume. The scribes would subtract a certain percentage from their calculations to account for these losses, ensuring the records reflected reality. This practical adjustment shows that the scribes were not merely theoretical mathematicians, but workers solving real-world problems. The formula was a tool, not a pure exercise. The unit of area called the ta could also be divided into smaller fractions for measuring partial plots, and these fractions were recorded in the tax documents. A farmer might own 3.5 tar of land, and the tax collector would calculate the obligation based on the exact fraction. The system allowed for precise accounting without requiring the farmer to own an exact multiple of the standard unit. The fractions were represented with specific symbols in the written record. The water level readings from the Nilometer were recorded on a daily basis during the flood season, and these records provide a continuous history of Nile flood levels over many centuries. Modern researchers can study these readings to understand climate patterns and the effects of drought on ancient Egyptian society. The data is remarkably complete, with gaps only during periods of political instability. The Nilometer provided essential information that shaped the national economy. The rope with knots was also used in construction, where it served as a guide for laying out straight lines and right angles. The surveyors would stake the rope at the corners of a building site, and the knots ensured the measurements were consistent. This technique was used for everything from houses to temples to pyramids, making the rope an essential construction tool. The method was simple but effective. The Deben weight for copper was approximately 91 grams, but the system allowed for slight variations depending on the purity of the metal. Higher quality copper might be weighed using a slightly different standard, and the records note these variations. The system was flexible enough to accommodate the realities of metal production while maintaining enough consistency for trade. The merchants navigated these variations as part of their daily business. The granary calculations were taught in scribal schools as part of the standard curriculum, and students practiced solving these problems on wooden writing boards. The board could be wiped clean and reused, allowing the student to try again if their answer was wrong. These exercises prepared the students for their future careers as administrators managing the grain supply. The problems were practical and closely tied to the needs of the state. The shore measurement for rope was typically 100 cubits, but the rope could be sold in any length, and the price was determined by the number of shores. This made it easy to price rope for construction projects and shipping. The rope makers would produce standard lengths, but they could also make custom orders for specific needs. The system was straightforward and efficient. The surveyors were among the most respected professionals in Egyptian society because their work was essential for the functioning of the agricultural economy. They traveled from village to village with their ropes and their records, ensuring that the fields were properly measured and the taxes were correctly assessed. Their work was difficult and required mathematical skill, which earned them a relatively high status. The surveyor's rope became a symbol of their authority. The Nilometer at Rosetta was another important measurement station, and its readings were compared with those from Elephantine to understand the behavior of the entire river. The flood traveled from south to north, so the readings from the southern stations provided advance warning of what would arrive further downstream. This information allowed communities to prepare for the flood and to manage their water resources effectively. The system was coordinated across the length of the Nile. The brick dimensions were not the only consideration for builders. The ratio of mud to straw in the brick mixture was also carefully controlled. Too much straw weakened the brick, while too little made it brittle and prone to cracking. The recipe was standardized, but variations existed depending on the quality of the local clay. The builders knew how to adjust the mixture to suit the available materials. The hin was also used to measure oil, which was a valuable commodity used for cooking, lighting, and cosmetics. The oil was stored in jars, and the volume was measured in hins when the jars were filled, and again when they were sold. The system allowed for consistent pricing and accurate record-keeping. The scribes tracked every transaction. The mathematical system used for granary calculations was based on practical geometry, but the scribes also understood that their approximation of pi was not exact. They used the same value repeatedly because it produced consistent results, and they were not concerned with abstract mathematical perfection. Their method worked well enough to manage the grain supply for an entire civilization. The system was practical and durable. The flood season, known as Akhet, historically began in mid-July, and its timing was determined not by a calendar, but by the appearance of a specific star in the pre-dawn sky. The star Sirius would rise just before the sun, and that celestial event signaled the start of the inundation. The farmers would watch for that particular morning when the star appeared, knowing the river would soon begin to rise. The connection between the star and the flood was so consistent that it became the anchor for the entire agricultural calendar. Emmer wheat was the primary grain cultivated in the Nile Valley, and it had a tough outer husk that made it difficult to thresh, but also resistant to pests and spoilage. The grain would be harvested, then beaten or trampled to separate the edible kernel from the protective husk. The process was labor-intensive, but the resulting grain could be stored for long periods without significant loss to insects or mold. This durability made emmer the backbone of the Egyptian food supply. The papyrus plant was harvested by cutting the stalks underwater, a technique that prevented the plant's internal sap from clogging the fibers used for making paper. The stems would be sliced into thin strips, laid crosswise, and pressed together to form sheets. The quality of the final product depended on how carefully the stalks were cut and prepared. The underwater cutting method was a specific technique that improved the quality of the finished papyrus. A particular breed of goose was developed specifically for fattening, and the practice involved force-feeding the birds to increase their weight before consumption. This technique was a precursor to the Roman practice of foie gras production, though the Egyptian method was less elaborate. The geese would be confined and fed a rich diet of grain until they became plump. The resulting meat was considered a delicacy. The jed pillar, a common decorative symbol, is botanically thought to represent a stylized tree trunk or a bundle of stalks tied together. The shape appears frequently in art and architecture, and its form suggests a connection to the natural world. The symbol was used in various contexts, and its origin in plant imagery is widely accepted by researchers. The pillar shape may have evolved from an actual bundle of reeds used in early construction. Linseed oil was pressed from flax seeds and served as a base for ointments and as a cooking oil. The seeds were crushed and pressed to extract the oil, which was then stored in jars for later use. The oil had a distinctive flavor and was used in both cooking and cosmetics. The production of linseed oil was a regular part of agricultural processing. The ancient Egyptians had a specific term for a swarm of locusts, and these swarms were considered a royal nuisance because they could devastate crops in a matter of hours. The government would organize efforts to drive the locusts away or to destroy them before they could cause significant damage. A swarm could strip entire fields of their vegetation, leading to food shortages and economic disruption. The term for the swarm reflected the seriousness of the threat. Flint sickles were used for harvesting grain even after bronze became a common metal, because flint could be sharpened to a razor edge and was readily available. The flint blade would be set into a wooden handle, and the farmer would swing the sickle back and forth to cut the stalks. The tool was simple but effective, and its use persisted alongside metal alternatives. The flint sickle remained a standard harvesting implement for centuries. The bark of the acacia tree was used as a mild astringent, and it was applied to wounds and sores to help them heal. The bark contained natural compounds that tightened tissue and reduced inflammation, making it a useful medicinal agent. The preparation was simple. The bark was ground or boiled to extract the active ingredients. The acacia tree was a common source of medicine. Vineyards were planted on elevated slopes to avoid the salt content of the lower valley soil, which could damage the vines and affect the flavor of the grapes. The salt from the floodwaters would accumulate in the low-lying areas, making them unsuitable for viticulture. The hillsides provided better drainage and prevented the roots from sitting in saline soil. The elevated vineyards produced better grapes and more consistent harvests. A specific variety of cucumber was cultivated in the Nile Valley, and it was eaten both fresh and pickled. The cucumber grew well in the warm climate and was a common addition to meals. The pickled version could be stored for months and was a valuable food during the lean seasons. The cultivation of cucumbers was a regular part of the agricultural cycle. The sycamore fig was a common tree throughout the region, and its fruit was eaten fresh or dried for later consumption. The tree provided a reliable source of food that could be harvested over an extended period. The fruits were sweet and nutritious, and they were often included in offerings and everyday meals. The sycamore fig was a familiar presence in the landscape. The harvest of emmer wheat involved cutting the stalks with the flint sickle, then gathering the sheaves into bundles for transport to the threshing floor. The cut stalks were laid in the sun to dry before being processed. The drying reduced the moisture content and made the grain easier to store. The entire process required careful timing to avoid losses from rain or pests. The goose breeding program involved selecting birds with desirable traits and mating them to produce larger, fatter offspring. The process was a form of early animal husbandry that improved the quality of the livestock. The resulting birds were a valuable source of meat and were often featured in the diets of the wealthy. The breeding program was a significant step in agricultural development. The drying process for papyrus involved laying the strips in the sun and pressing them flat with weights. The sun's heat removed moisture and helped the fibers bond together to form a single sheet. The sheets could then be glued together to form long rolls for writing. The quality of the papyrus depended on the skill of the craftsman and the conditions during drying. Flax was planted in the late fall and harvested in the spring, and the fibers were extracted from the stems through a process of retting. The stems were soaked in water to soften the fibers, then dried and combed to separate the long strands for weaving. The resulting linen was a prized fabric. The entire process was labor-intensive and required careful timing. The acacia bark was harvested by cutting strips from the tree and allowing them to dry before use. The bark could be stored for extended periods without spoiling, making it a convenient medicinal material. The strips were easy to transport and prepare as needed. The acacia tree provided a sustainable source of medicine. The elevated vineyard slopes were often terraced to prevent erosion and to make the best use of the available land. The terraces allowed the vines to be planted on steep hillsides that would otherwise be unusable. The construction of the terraces required significant effort but improved the productivity of the land. The terraced vineyards were a visible feature of the landscape. The cucumbers were grown in rows and irrigated regularly to maintain the moisture levels they needed. The plants grew quickly and could be harvested within a few months of planting. The pickling process involved soaking the cucumbers in brine and spices. The preserved cucumbers were a welcome addition to the diet. The sycamore fig tree produced multiple crops throughout the year, making it a reliable food source. The fruits would ripen at different times, allowing for a sustained harvest. The trees were often planted near homes and villages. The presence of a sycamore fig tree was a sign of stability and food security. The flood cycle determined the entire agricultural year, and the farmers adapted their activities to the seasonal pattern. The summer months were a time of preparation and waiting, while the fall was the season of planting after the waters receded. The winter and spring were periods of growth and harvest. The cycle was predictable and deeply understood. The emmer wheat was planted in the fall after the floodwaters had subsided, and the seed was scattered by hand across the damp soil. The grain sprouted quickly in the rich silt, and the green shoots would appear within weeks. The plants grew steadily through the winter and were ready for harvest in the spring. The entire cycle lasted about 8 months. The papyrus thickets along the Nile provided habitat for various birds and animals, and the plant itself was used for paper, rope, and baskets. The stems were versatile and could be processed into many different products. The thickets were a valuable natural resource that was managed carefully. The harvest was timed to avoid damaging the plants. The geese were fed a diet of grain mixed with water, and they were force-fed by hand to increase their weight rapidly. The birds would be held and the food inserted directly into their throats. The process was repeated daily until the birds reached their target weight. The result was meat that was tender and fatty. The jed pillar was carved from wood or stone and stood upright in various settings. The shape resembles a bundle of stalks bound together, and the pillar itself served as a decorative element. The image appears in paintings and reliefs. The use of the pillar persisted for thousands of years. The linseed oil was extracted using a press, and the remaining seed cake was used as animal feed. The oil was stored in clay jars and used as needed. The press was a simple but effective machine. The oil was a valuable commodity. The locust swarms could travel hundreds of kilometers, and they would arrive without warning, consuming everything in their path. The government would mobilize people to drive the swarms away with noise and smoke. The efforts were often unsuccessful, and the locusts would cause significant damage. The swarms were a recurring problem. The flint sickle was used by generations of farmers, and the technique for shaping the blade was passed down through families. Flint was knapped to create a sharp edge, and the blade was set into the handle. The sickle was a familiar tool in every household. The use of flint persisted because it worked. The acacia bark was often combined with other plant extracts to create more effective treatments. The mixtures were prepared according to traditional recipes. The bark was a trusted remedy. The acacia tree was a valuable medical resource. The elevated vineyards required careful management to ensure the vines had adequate water and nutrients. The hillside location meant that irrigation was more difficult than in the valley. The farmers developed techniques to channel water to the slopes. The vineyards were a significant investment. The cucumbers were picked while still green and firm, and they were processed immediately to preserve their freshness. The pickling process involved washing and packing them into jars. The pickled cucumbers were ready to eat in a few weeks. They were a popular food. The sycamore fig provided shade as well as fruit, and the trees were often planted in public spaces. The broad leaves created a cooling canopy that was welcome in the heat. The fruit was a treat for children and adults alike. The tree was a gift to the community. The Egyptian word for gold was nub, and that term became the root of the name for the region to the south, Nubia, where much of the gold was sourced. The word was simple and direct, a practical label for a valuable metal. The connection between the word and the place persisted for centuries, linking language to geography in a way that outlasted the civilization itself. Copper was known as the metal from the mountains, and the Egyptians identified different types of copper by their color and source. The metal was essential for tools and weapons, and its various forms were distinguished by subtle differences in hue. The copper came primarily from the Red Sea hills of the eastern desert, where malachite deposits were abundant along the natural trade routes. The sources were known and exploited for generations. Iron was called the metal of the sky because the first samples encountered by the Egyptians came from meteorites that had fallen to Earth. The term reflected a genuine observation about the origin of the metal, which was rare and valuable long before the widespread adoption of iron smelting. The connection to the sky was literal. The iron had indeed fallen from above. A specific white limestone from the Tura quarries was used for the outer casing of pyramids, prized for its fine grain and bright color. The stone was transported across the river to the Giza Plateau and other construction sites. The quality of this limestone made it the preferred material for the most visible surfaces of monumental buildings. The quarries at Tura were a significant industrial operation. The black-colored silt of the Nile Valley was referred to as Kemet, which is the origin of one of the names for the country itself. The word meant black land, and it referred specifically to the fertile soil deposited by the annual flood. The contrast between the black land and the red desert was a fundamental division in the Egyptian understanding of their world. Faience was a manufactured substance produced by grinding quartz or sand crystals and mixing them with sodium, potassium, calcium, and various metal oxides. The mixture was shaped and heated, and during the firing process, it would develop a bright glaze. The Egyptians perfected this technique to imitate turquoise and other hard-to-find gemstones. The production of faience was a specialized craft that reached extraordinary levels of skill. Ebony was imported from the south and was highly prized for its density and dark color, which made it suitable for high-quality furniture and decorative objects. The wood was rare and valuable, and its presence in a tomb or household indicated wealth and status. The import of ebony required long-distance trade networks that extended deep into Africa. The wood was a luxury material. A type of mortar made from burnt gypsum was used in construction, and this material hardens by absorbing water after application. The gypsum was heated to drive off the water, then slaked and applied in thin layers between heavy stones. The resulting bond was strong and durable. This mortar was a practical solution for building with large stone blocks. Red granite from Aswan had a specific name that identified it as the Stone of the South, and it was used extensively for statues and monumental architecture. The stone was difficult to quarry and transport, but its durability made it ideal for structures intended to last. The quarries at Aswan provided this distinctive stone for millennia. The granite was a defining material of Egyptian monumental art. Alabaster, a soft stone, was used for making vessels and small statues because it was easy to carve and had a translucent quality when thin. The stone was quarried in several locations and worked into a variety of objects. The material was valued for its appearance and workability. Alabaster objects were common in tombs and temples. The Egyptians used natron as a soap for cleaning and also as a preservative for mummification. The salt mixture was harvested from dry lake beds and was versatile enough for both hygiene and mortuary practices. When mixed with oil, it formed an early form of soap for washing the body. The same material was used to dry and preserve fish and meat. Copper was also obtained from the Sinai Peninsula, where the mines at Serabit el Khadim produced turquoise as well as copper ores. The expeditions to these mines were significant undertakings, and the area was known for its mineral wealth. The turquoise was highly valued, and the copper was a practical necessity. The mines were worked for thousands of years. The word Kemet distinguished the cultivated land from the surrounding deserts, which were called Desheret, or the Red Land. The red land referred to the desert sand, which was starkly different from the dark soil of the Nile Valley. This division was a basic geographical fact that shaped how the Egyptians understood their environment. The contrast was visible from almost any vantage point. Faience production involved a technique where the glaze formed during firing through a process of efflorescence, where soluble alkali salts were carried to the surface and fused with the quartz. The process was carefully controlled to achieve the desired color and finish. The technique was a significant technological achievement. The resulting objects were vibrant and durable. The Tura limestone was transported across the Nile on barges, and the massive blocks were maneuvered into place using ramps and levers. The logistics of moving such heavy stone required careful planning and organization. The quarry operations were major state enterprises. The white limestone became a signature material of the Pyramid Age. The term metal of the sky for iron persisted even after smelting became common, suggesting a deep linguistic tradition that linked the metal to its celestial origins. The name was a cultural memory of the first encounters with the material. The connection between iron and the sky was embedded in the language itself. The term outlasted the original context. Ebony was sometimes combined with gold and other luxury materials to create furniture of extraordinary quality. The wood was difficult to work because of its density, but the results were prized for their beauty. The craftsmanship required to shape ebony was highly respected. The finished objects were considered treasures. The gypsum mortar was used in limestone construction, and the material was applied in thin layers to create a tight seal between stones. The mortar set quickly and provided a strong bond. The technique was effective and durable. The use of gypsum mortar was a standard construction practice. The Aswan granite was quarried by pounding the stone with dolerite balls, a labor-intensive process that required many workers. The granite was then transported to construction sites along the Nile. The quarries produced stone for thousands of years. The granite was a constant presence in Egyptian architecture. Alabaster vessels were often carved with thin walls to allow light to pass through, and the translucent quality of the stone was admired. The vessels were used for oils and other valuable liquids. The carving required skill and patience. The resulting objects were both functional and decorative. The faience workshop at Abydos dates to approximately 5500 BCE and represents some of the earliest evidence of this craft. The workshop consisted of circular pits that were likely kilns, with layers of ash indicating continuous use. The discovery provides a glimpse into the early development of faience production. The craft was already well established by this period. The name Kemet was used by the Egyptians to refer to their country, and the term reflected the centrality of the Nile's fertility to their identity. The black soil was the foundation of their civilization. The name was a statement of their connection to the land. The term continued in use throughout their history. The turquoise mined in Sinai was a prized gemstone, and the expeditions to obtain it were sometimes military campaigns. The value of the turquoise justified the effort required to secure the mines. The stone was used for jewelry and inlays. The Sinai mines were a significant source of wealth. The process of making faience was developed in Mesopotamia and then perfected by Egyptian artisans, who achieved a level of quality that surpassed their predecessors. The Egyptians innovated in the materials and techniques used. The result was a distinctive form of craft that became an Egyptian specialty. The faience objects produced in Egypt were widely traded. The term nub for gold gave rise to the name of the region Nubia, which was a major source of the metal. The connection between the word and the place was direct and enduring. The gold from Nubia was a major factor in the Egyptian economy. The region's name was derived from its most famous product. The iron from meteorites was used for ritual objects and jewelry, and the metal was considered special because of its celestial origin. The pieces were rare and valued for their unusual material. The use of meteoritic iron predates the widespread adoption of smelted iron. The metal was a material of prestige. The natron deposits in the Wadi Natron provided a reliable source of the salt mixture, and the area's name reflects the importance of the mineral. The natron was harvested from the dry lake beds and used throughout Egypt. The resource was essential for both daily life and mortuary practices. The valley's name became synonymous with the mineral itself. The limestone from Tura was so fine that it was used for statues as well as for building stones, and its quality made it a preferred material for sculpture. The stone could be carved with great detail. The quarries produced limestone of consistently high quality. The material was a key resource for Egyptian artists. The faience objects were often bright blue or green, colors that were associated with fertility and rebirth, though the artisans also produced other colors for variety. The color was achieved by adding copper oxide to the mixture, which turned the glaze a vibrant turquoise during firing. The technique was a chemical achievement. The resulting objects were visually striking. The Egyptian word for faience was tiehenet, which means gleaming or shining, reflecting the glossy finish of the glazed surface. The term emphasized the appearance of the objects. The glaze was a defining feature of the craft. The name captured the quality of the finished product. The oldest known medical papyrus describes a remedy for a wound using honey and a copper-based antiseptic. The honey would be applied directly to the injury, and the copper salts would help prevent infection. The combination was surprisingly effective, and the treatment was documented in detail. The recipe was part of a larger collection of medical knowledge. The physician was known as a sunu, and this term distinguished the general practitioner from other types of healers in Egyptian society. The sunu would examine the patient, feel the pulse, and then prescribe treatments based on their observations. The profession was well established and respected. The sunu was the primary caregiver for most medical needs. They used a mixture of ground animal hooves and donkey milk as a topical treatment for certain conditions. The hooves would be ground into a powder and mixed with the milk to create a paste. The paste was applied to wounds and sores to promote healing. The preparation was a standard remedy in the medical texts. A documented procedure for removing splinters involved using a heated lance to open the skin and extract the foreign object. The lance would be heated until it was hot, then used to make an incision. The splinter would then be removed with tweezers or by squeezing. The procedure was performed with care to minimize further injury. Castor oil was used as a laxative, a practice that continued well into the classical era. The oil was extracted from castor beans and consumed in small amounts to relieve constipation. The treatment was effective and widely used. The use of castor oil persisted for thousands of years. Dentists existed as a specific profession, and one known specialist was called Hesi-Ra, who held the title Chief of Dentists. Hesi-Ra lived during the 3rd dynasty, making him the earliest named dentist in history. His tomb contained wooden panels depicting him in his various professional roles. The title suggests that dentistry was a recognized specialty. A specific type of eye paint was used not just for cosmetics but for its practical benefits. The paint, made from galena or malachite, helped reduce glare from the sun and repelled flies. The black paint was particularly effective at protecting the eyes. The Egyptians used the paint for both health and appearance. They employed a treatment for burns consisting of a mixture of resin and honey. The resin would be ground into a powder and mixed with honey to create a salve. The salve would be applied to the burn to soothe the skin and prevent infection. The treatment was documented in the medical papyri. The Edwin Smith papyrus details the examination of a wound by palpation and visual inspection. The physician would feel the wound with their fingers to assess its depth and severity. They would also look at the wound carefully to determine the best course of treatment. The examination was methodical and precise. They had a specific measurement for the amount of water used in a steam inhalation treatment. The water would be heated and the steam directed to the patient's face to treat respiratory conditions. The amount of water was measured precisely to ensure the treatment was effective. The instructions were recorded in the medical texts. A type of poultice made from bread and mold was used for infected wounds. The mold contained natural antibiotics that would help fight the infection. The bread would be moistened and applied directly to the wound. The treatment was documented in the medical papyri. They had a specific term for a headache and documented several treatments involving plant extracts. The extracts were made from various herbs and applied or consumed to relieve the pain. The treatments were recorded in the medical texts. The condition was recognized and addressed. The Sunu would often use a combination of practical medicine and protective spells, but the Edwin Smith papyrus is notable for its rational approach. Unlike other medical texts, this papyrus relies on observation and treatment rather than magic. The text is a milestone in the history of medicine. The approach was remarkably empirical for its time. The eye paint was stored in small containers called kohl pots, which were often made of alabaster or other fine materials. The pots would be filled with the ground pigment and carried with the owner. The use of kohl was widespread across all levels of society. The containers were often works of art themselves. The castor oil plant was cultivated specifically for its medicinal properties, and the oil was extracted by pressing the seeds. The oil was then stored in jars and used as needed. The plant was a common sight in gardens and farms. The oil was a valuable commodity. The dentist Hesi-Ra also held the title Great One of the Ivory Cutters, which may suggest he worked with ivory as well as teeth. The exact meaning of the title is debated, but it indicates a connection to dental and ivory work. The ambiguity adds to the mystery of his profession. The title was significant and prestigious. The eye paint was made from galena, a lead sulfide that came from mines near the Red Sea. The mineral was ground into a fine powder and mixed with other ingredients. The resulting paint was applied to the eyes with a small stick. The galena gave the paint its distinctive black color. The steam inhalation treatment was used for respiratory infections and involved boiling water and directing the steam to the patient. The treatment was one of several methods used to relieve congestion. The instructions were precise and detailed. The treatment was a standard part of medical practice. The bread and mold poultice was a form of early antibiotic treatment, anticipating the discovery of penicillin by thousands of years. The mold would grow on the bread and produce compounds that killed bacteria. The poultice was a practical and effective remedy. The discovery was a significant medical achievement. The headache treatments involved herbs like coriander, which were ground and mixed with water or oil. The mixtures were then applied to the head or consumed. The remedies were documented in the medical papyri. The treatments were varied and numerous. The Sunu profession was hereditary, with knowledge passed from father to son, and the training was rigorous. The apprentices would learn by observing their fathers and practicing on patients. The profession was a family tradition. The knowledge was carefully preserved and transmitted. The medical papyri were written in hieratic, a cursive form of Egyptian that was used for everyday documents. The texts were practical manuals for physicians, not religious texts. The writing was clear and direct. The papyri were essential tools for medical practice. The use of honey as a wound dressing was effective because honey has natural antibacterial properties. The honey would prevent infection and promote healing. The Egyptians recognized the value of honey in medicine. The remedy was a cornerstone of wound care. The copper-based antiseptic was made from copper salts, which are toxic to bacteria. The Egyptians would apply the copper solution to wounds to prevent infection. The treatment was documented in the medical papyri. The use of copper was a significant innovation. The physician would classify each case into one of three categories: an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, or an ailment not to be treated. This triage system allowed the physician to focus resources on treatable conditions. The system was rational and practical. The approach was a significant advancement in medical practice. The headrest used in tombs was a practical object for sleeping, and it was also a medical tool for supporting the head. The headrest would be placed under the neck to keep the head elevated. The object was both functional and symbolic. The headrest was a common item in daily life. The medical papyri include detailed anatomical descriptions, including references to the brain, cerebrospinal fluid, and meninges. The Egyptians had a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy. The descriptions were remarkably accurate for their time. The knowledge was based on observation and experience. The use of steam inhalation was one of several respiratory treatments documented in the medical texts. The treatments were varied and tailored to the specific condition. The physicians had a range of options for treating respiratory ailments. The remedies were documented in detail. The copper mines of Sinai provided the mineral for the antiseptic treatments, and the copper was transported along the Nile. The copper was a valuable resource for both tools and medicine. The trade routes were well established. The copper was essential for medical practice. The physician would examine the patient's pulse to diagnose internal conditions, recognizing the connection between the heart and the rest of the body. The pulse was felt at various points to assess the patient's health. The examination was a standard part of diagnosis. The practice was a significant medical advance. The word for papyrus gave us the word paper via the Greek term papyros, which was borrowed directly from the Egyptian name for the plant. The Greeks adopted the term along with the writing material itself. The word traveled across languages and has remained in use for millennia. The connection between the plant and the modern word is direct. The hieroglyph for house was a simple rectangle with a slight indentation at the top, a silhouette of a basic building with a doorway. The shape was a recognizable floor plan or elevation of an ordinary dwelling. The symbol was used in countless inscriptions to represent the concept of a home or building. The design was practical and clear. The ancient Egyptians had their own term for foreigners, and it meant those who don't speak the language, a practical description that focused on communication rather than ethnicity. The term was used for anyone who came from outside the Nile Valley and spoke a different tongue. The word reflected a linguistic rather than a geographical distinction. The label was straightforward and descriptive. The Ankh symbol is thought by many scholars to represent a sandal strap or a knot, rather than any specific ceremonial object. The shape appears in art and inscriptions, and its origin may be entirely practical. The symbol was used widely and became one of the most recognizable Egyptian signs. The meaning may have evolved from a simple everyday item. The Greek word obriza for pure gold may have origins in an Egyptian term, suggesting that the trade in precious metals carried linguistic influence along with the material itself. The word appears in classical texts describing high-quality gold. The connection points to the flow of goods and language between cultures. The origins of the term are traced through trade networks. The hieroglyph for right shows a palette and brush, a very practical representation of the tools used by scribes. The image is a direct depiction of the equipment required for writing. The symbol appears in contexts related to literacy and record-keeping. The representation is concrete and functional. Scribes wrote on ostraca, which were pottery shards, for notes and drafts, reserving papyrus for formal documents and important records. The potsherds were plentiful and essentially free, making them ideal for practice and everyday writing. The use of ostraca was widespread and practical. The practice left a rich archaeological record. The term alchemy likely derives from the Arabic alchemia, but that may trace back to the Egyptian word chem, meaning black earth, the fertile soil of the Nile Valley. The connection suggests a link between Egyptian knowledge and later chemical traditions. The etymology is debated but points to Egypt as a source. The word has traveled through many languages. They used a specific sign known as a determinative to clarify the category of a word, such as indicating whether it referred to a person, a place, or an action. The determinatives were not pronounced but served as visual guides to meaning. They helped distinguish between words with the same spelling. The system was a sophisticated feature of the writing. The term ebony, used to refer to a specific dark wood imported from the south, came via the Egyptian heigieni, the ancient name for the valuable timber. The word traveled through Greek and Latin into modern languages. The origin of the term reflects the trade routes that brought the wood to Egypt. The name was attached to the material itself. They had a specific term for a scribe's palette, which was a common item to own and a symbol of literacy. The palette was a wooden board with hollows for ink and a slot for reed brushes. The object was both a tool and a status symbol. The term for the palette appears in many inscriptions. They used a simplified script called hieratic for everyday writing, in contrast to the more formal hieroglyphs used for monuments. The word hieratic comes from a Greek description meaning priestly, but this name is somewhat misleading, as the script was used for far more than religious texts. Most Egyptians learned to read and write hieratic first. Hieroglyphs were a specialty studied later. The script was faster to write and more practical for daily use. The term for the sedge plant, a common marsh plant, was used as a symbol for Upper Egypt and appeared in the king's formal titles. The plant grew abundantly in the Nile Valley and had practical uses in construction and weaving. The hieroglyph for the plant was a common element in royal names. The word reflected the importance of the plant to the landscape. The word serek referred to the palace facade and was used for a specific type of royal name enclosure that predated the cartouche. The serek was a rectangular design representing the niched facade of a royal palace. The king's name was written inside, and a falcon was placed above. The term literally meant facade in Egyptian. The hieratic script developed ligatures, allowing two or more signs to be written in a single stroke. This made writing faster and more efficient for everyday documents. The ligatures changed over time and varied between scribes. The system was a natural evolution of cursive writing. The word hekat, for grain measurement, appears in administrative texts alongside the symbols for the various fractional units. The term was used for thousands of years. The measurement was a standard part of the scribal vocabulary. The word appears in countless papyri. The term for a musical group was kaner, and it referred to an ensemble of singers and instrumentalists. The groups were attached to various institutions, including palaces and wealthy households. The members were often women, called shemayet, which is a specific term for a female singer or musician. The existence of such a term indicates a recognized profession. The Egyptian word for faience was chehenet, meaning gleaming or shining, reflecting the glossy finish of the glazed surface. The term emphasized the appearance of the objects. The glaze was a defining feature of the craft. The name captured the quality of the finished product. The term arura was the Greek name for a unit of area, derived from the Egyptian satat, a square of 100 cubits. The Greek word was a translation of the Egyptian term. The unit was adopted by the Greek rulers of Egypt. The name reflects the continuity of measurement. The number of hieroglyphic signs varied over time, from about 800 in the Middle Kingdom to as many as 6,000 in the Greco-Roman period. The increase in signs during later periods reflects a deliberate expansion of the writing system. The scribes invented new signs using learned methods. The writing system was never static. The word shen meant encircling in ancient Egyptian, and the shen ring was a symbol represented as a loop of rope bound to a stick. The shape was used as a protective symbol in art and inscriptions. The elongated form of the shen ring became the cartouche, a loop that enclosed and protected a royal name. The term described the shape of the object. The determinative signs were always placed at the end of words and acted as semantic classifiers. They indicated which category a word belonged to, such as buildings, people, or actions. The determinatives were not pronounced, but helped clarify meaning. The system was an essential feature of Egyptian writing. The word for scribe was sesh, and it referred to someone who could read and write. The term was a title of status and respect. The scribe was a central figure in Egyptian administration. The word appears in countless contexts. The was scepter, represented by a hieroglyph, was a staff with a forked bottom and a head shaped like an animal. The hieroglyph for the staff came to signify dominion or power in a secular administrative sense. The sign was used in writing to indicate authority. The origin of the scepter may have been a practical tool. The modern name hieratic is a misnomer, as the script was not exclusively used by priests, but was the standard everyday writing for most of Egyptian history. The Greeks gave it this name because they encountered it in religious contexts. The Egyptians themselves simply called it writing. The term has stuck despite its inaccuracy. The Demotic script replaced hieratic for everyday administrative purposes around the 7th century BCE. The name comes from the Greek demotikos, meaning for the people or in common use. The script was even more cursive than hieratic. The term reflects its popular usage. The hieratic script was written from right to left, and in earlier times the lines were arranged vertically, but around 2000 BCE they changed to a horizontal format. The change in direction and layout was a significant shift in writing practice. The horizontal format was more efficient for long texts. The new layout became standard. The word for the sedge plant could also be written with the sign for king in some contexts, reflecting a connection between the plant and royal symbolism. The plant represented Upper Egypt, and the king was the ruler of both lands. The writing of the word sometimes mirrored the king's title. The connection was a linguistic one. The serech was the earliest convention for setting apart royal names, predating the cartouche by about 4 dynasties. The serech was used from the earliest dynasties and remained in use for thousands of years. The cartouche eventually replaced it as the more common royal name enclosure. The serech fell out of common use by the end of the Old Kingdom. The term for overseer of the Caner was a specific title for the leader of a musical ensemble. The title appears in inscriptions from various periods. The position involved managing the group's performances and activities. The title was a recognized administrative role. The number of signs in the hieroglyphic writing system expanded significantly in the Greco-Roman period, reaching up to 6,000 signs in some temples. The increase was due to the creation of new signs by learned scribes. The new signs were not for everyday use, but were part of a learned tradition. The expansion was a deliberate innovation. The word for paper in modern languages traces back through Greek to the Egyptian word for the papyrus plant. The plant was harvested, processed, and turned into writing material. The name of the material traveled with the trade goods. The word has remained in use for over 2,000 years. The term shemayet specifically referred to a female musician or singer in Egyptian society, and the role was a recognized profession. The shemayet were part of musical ensembles called sheners. The title appears on coffins and in tomb inscriptions. The existence of the term indicates the importance of music in Egyptian culture. The writing system with determinatives, phonograms, and ideograms was a complex and sophisticated method of representing language. The combination of different sign types allowed for precise communication. The system was learned through years of training. The complexity was a feature, not a flaw. The slope of a pyramid was measured in terms of the seked, which was the horizontal run for a vertical drop of 1 royal cubit. The seked was a ratio that determined the angle of the pyramid's sides, expressed as a number of palms and fingers of horizontal distance per cubit of height. The builders used this measurement to ensure that all 4 sides had the same angle. The seked was a practical tool for construction planning. Walls in ancient Egyptian architecture were built with a technique called battering, where they lean inward to distribute weight and increase stability. The walls slope slightly as they rise, which makes them more resistant to collapse. This technique was used in both stone and mud brick construction. The battering gave Egyptian buildings their distinctive tapering appearance. The foundation trenches of temples were often filled with clean sand to level the base before construction began. The sand provided a stable, level surface for the heavy stone blocks. The trenches were dug deep enough to reach solid ground, then filled and compacted. The sand foundation was a simple but effective engineering solution. Wooden mallets were used to shape stone, not just metal chisels, because the wooden mallets could strike the chisels without damaging them. The mallets were made from hardwood such as acacia or sycamore, and they were used to drive the chisels into the stone. The technique was labor-intensive but effective. The mallets had to be replaced frequently as they wore down. Columns were not always made of solid stone. Some were built of multiple drums stacked on top of each other. The drums were cut from stone and then stacked and aligned with precision. The joints between the drums were often hidden with plaster or paint. The drum construction made it easier to transport and lift the heavy column sections. A specific type of clamp made of metal in the shape of a dovetail was used to hold stones together. The clamp would be inserted into slots cut into the faces of 2 adjacent blocks. The dovetail shape prevented the stones from pulling apart. The clamps were often made of bronze or copper. This technique was used to secure the stones in temples and other important structures. The lintel above a doorway was often a single massive stone, and its weight was carefully calculated to avoid cracking under the load of the masonry above it. The builders would select a stone large enough to span the opening and strong enough to support the weight above. The lintel was typically made of limestone or granite for strength. The stone was lifted into place using ramps and levers. A type of limestone with a particularly fine grain was used for statues because it could be carved with great detail. This fine-grained limestone came from specific quarries and was prized for its smooth surface. The stone was easier to carve than coarser limestone and held intricate details well. The use of this stone allowed sculptors to achieve remarkable precision. The ramps used to build pyramids were likely constructed of mud brick and stone rubble, and they were extended as the building rose in height. The ramps were built on an incline, and the stones were dragged up them on sledges. The ramps were dismantled when the construction was complete. The exact design of the ramps is still debated. A drainage system using stone channels was incorporated around the bases of temples to channel water away from the foundations. The channels directed rainwater and floodwater away from the structure. The system was designed to prevent water from pooling around the foundation stones. The drainage was an important part of temple construction. A specific type of scaffolding made from palm logs was used in construction projects to reach higher levels. The logs were lashed together and supported by the building itself. The scaffolding allowed workers to access the upper parts of walls and columns. The use of palm logs was a practical solution, as wood was scarce. Walls were painted using a dry technique, not fresco, where paint was applied to dry plaster. The paint was mixed with a binder and applied to the surface after the plaster had set. The technique was common in Egyptian painting. The dry plaster allowed the paint to be applied with care. The core of most pyramids consists of a series of buttress walls surrounding a central core, with the walls decreasing in height from the center outward. This internal structure added stability and reduced the amount of stone needed. The voids between the walls were filled with rubble and loose stone. The design was an efficient use of materials. The casing stones of pyramids were often made of high-quality Tura limestone, which was brought from across the Nile. The casing stones were carefully dressed and fitted to create a smooth, angled surface. The limestone was transported by boat during the flood season. The white casing gave the pyramids their bright appearance. The joints between stone blocks were often so tight that a thin blade could not be inserted between them. The stones were shaped and fitted with precision to achieve a tight seal. The builders would smooth and polish the faces of the stones to ensure they fit together perfectly. The tight joints added stability to the structure. The use of gypsum mortar in pyramid construction allowed the stones to be set with a fine, strong bond, and the gypsum was sourced from the Nile Delta. The gypsum was heated to drive off the water, then ground to a powder. The powder was mixed with sand and water to create the mortar. The use of gypsum was common in Old Kingdom construction. Lintels over doorways were sometimes made of red granite, which was imported from Aswan and was strong enough to span large openings without cracking. The granite was transported down the Nile on barges. The use of granite for lintels added strength and prestige to the structure. The stone was difficult to carve, but very durable. The construction of temples often took many years, and the work was often interrupted by the annual Nile flood. The workforce would be employed on the construction during the flood season when farming was not possible. The construction season typically ran from the time the waters receded until the next flood. The annual cycle dictated the building schedule. The building stones were quarried using dolerite pounding balls to shape the stone blocks before they were moved to the construction site. The pounding balls were hard and heavy, and they were used to break the stone by percussion. The technique was very laborious, but effective for extracting large stones. The roofs of temples were often made of massive stone blocks laid across the walls, creating flat roofs, supported by the columns and walls. The blocks were heavy and required precise placement. The flat roof design was common in Egyptian architecture. The roofs provided space for the temple's upper decorations. The surface of the stones was often left rough until they were set in place, at which point the masons would smooth them down carefully. The stones were smoothed from the top down, often as the work platforms were being dismantled. The process was a final refinement in the construction. The walls of temples were sometimes built with a slight inward battering for the same reason as the pyramids, to increase stability and prevent collapse under the weight of the stones above them. The battering was a standard technique used across many buildings. The use of wooden beams in construction was limited by the scarcity of wood in Egypt, but wood was still used for roofing and scaffolding when available. The wood was often imported from regions like Lebanon or Nubia. The use of wood was a significant investment. The columns in Egyptian temples were often carved to resemble plants, such as papyrus or lotus, using a technique that created fluted shafts and elaborate capitals. The plant columns were a decorative feature. The carvings were added after the columns were set in place. The construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza involved the movement of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2.5 and 15 tons. The blocks were quarried locally for the inner core and brought from farther afield for the outer casing. The logistics of moving such a vast quantity of stone are astonishing. The size of the stones in the lower courses of the pyramid is larger than those in the higher courses. The builders used larger stones at the base to provide stability and gradually reduced the size of the blocks as the pyramid rose. The larger stones at the base were also easier to quarry and transport. The variation in size was a structural feature. The use of mud brick ramps in construction is documented in various sources, and the ramps are known to have been built on a massive scale for large projects. The ramps allowed the builders to drag the stones up to the required height. The ramp system was a practical way to handle the scale of construction. The construction of the Great Pyramid is estimated to have taken about 20 years, based on historical records. This timeline would have required the movement of about 800 tons of stone each day on average. The figure includes quarrying, transporting, setting, and finishing the stones. The burial chambers inside the pyramids were often lined with granite from Aswan, which was considered a particularly strong stone. The granite was used because it was harder and more durable than the local limestone. The use of granite in the interior chambers provided structural support and protection. The stone was also a material of prestige. The surface of the stone walls in temples and tombs was often polished to a smooth finish to provide a surface for painting or carving. The polishing was done with grinding stones and abrasive sands. The polished surface was a feature of high-quality construction. The placement of the stones in the pyramid's core was done with the buttress walls, and the packing stones were placed on top of them to complete the structure. The core design added stability to the pyramid. The packing stones were the outer layer of the pyramid. The building of the pylons at temple entrances used the same battering wall technique, and the pylons were massive structures with large stone blocks. The pylon was a distinctive architectural feature. The battering technique was essential to maintaining stability for such tall structures. The linen used for wrapping mummies was often recycled from everyday clothing and household linens. The bandages would be taken from garments that had been worn and washed many times, and some of them still show traces of mending from their previous use. The practice made economic sense, because fabric was expensive and not easily replaced. The recycling was a practical solution to the cost of textile production. The standard loom used in Egyptian weaving was horizontal, where the weaver sat on the ground and worked the warp and weft with their feet. The loom lay flat on the floor, and the weaver would pass the shuttle back and forth while using their feet to separate the threads. This type of loom was the primary weaving tool from the earliest periods until the New Kingdom, when a vertical loom was introduced. The horizontal loom remained in common use even after the vertical loom appeared. The Egyptians had a specific term for the pleating of linen fabric, which was a popular style of decoration for clothing. The pleats were created by folding the linen while it was still damp and allowing it to dry, and the stiffness of the natural starch in the flax fibers helped the folds hold their shape. The pleating could be fine and intricate, and the style was adopted by both men and women. The technique was a distinctive feature of Egyptian fashion. The average length of a bolt of linen was about 8 to 10 meters, which was enough fabric to make a garment or a set of household linens. The bolts were woven on the horizontal looms and then rolled for storage and transport. The standard length made it easier to measure and sell the fabric. The bolts were a common commodity in the marketplace. A reddish-purple dye was obtained from a specific type of lichen, and it was used for certain ceremonial cloths and garments. The dye was applied to the linen, though linen is notoriously difficult to dye because it is a cellulose fiber, and the color would often fade to a soft pink over time. The lichen dye was a valued colorant for special textiles. The use of the dye was relatively rare. Wool was considered somewhat impure for use in temple contexts, but it was still used for ordinary clothing and household items. The belief about wool's impurity was a specific restriction, not a universal ban on the material. Wool garments were worn by some Egyptians, and the fabric was used for various purposes. The restriction on wool for certain contexts meant that linen was the preferred fabric for official and sacred uses. A specific tool, a pin bezel, was used to fasten the shoulder of a dress or other garment. The pin was a simple device that held the fabric in place, without the need for sewing. The tool was a practical solution for creating a fitted appearance without altering the basic shape of the garment. The use of such pins was common in Egyptian clothing. The king's ceremonial robe was often decorated with a pattern of small discs, which were sewn onto the fabric or woven into the design. The discs added a reflective quality to the garment and indicated the wealth and status of the wearer. The pattern was a distinctive feature of royal attire. The decoration was a form of conspicuous display. A type of heavy linen was used for sails on ships, and it was woven in a specific way to handle the wind. The linen was strong and durable, and the weave was designed to catch the wind effectively. The sails were essential for river travel and trade. The heavy linen was an important material for transportation. The kilt was a basic garment for men, often wrapped and tied at the front, with the pattern of folds indicating social status. The folds of the kilt were carefully arranged, and the style of the kilt varied over time, from simple loincloths to elaborate pleated garments. The kilt was worn by all levels of society, and the quality of the linen and the complexity of the pleating indicated the wearer's position. A specific type of flax was used to produce particularly fine thread for high-quality linen, and this flax was harvested while still green to maintain a pale color. The fiber from the green flax was finer and more delicate, and the resulting linen was prized for its quality. The highest quality linen was almost translucent and could be compared to silk. The finest linen was a luxury item. There was a specific term for a garment that was doubled over at the waist, indicating a style of wearing that was common in certain periods. The doubled-over garment added volume to the clothing and changed the silhouette. The practice was a fashion choice that varied over time. The term for the style was part of the specialized vocabulary of clothing. The Egyptians used pigments to color some textiles, applying the color to the surface of the fabric. Both yellow and red ochre were used to color textiles found in Old Kingdom burials, and the pigments were a form of paint rather than a true dye. The colored textiles were less common than undyed linen, but they were a form of decoration. The use of pigment was an alternative to dyeing. The horizontal loom was a common sight in Egyptian workshops, and depictions of the looms appear in tomb paintings from the Middle Kingdom onward. The weavers would sit or kneel on the ground, and the warp threads were stretched between two beams. The loom was a simple but effective tool for producing large quantities of linen. The horizontal loom was a standard piece of equipment. The pleated linen garments were often depicted in art, and the style was particularly popular for the clothing of high-status individuals. The pleats would be arranged in a pattern that was visually striking, and the stiffness of the linen helped the pleats maintain their shape. The pleats were a distinctive feature of Egyptian formal wear. The style was a mark of elegance. The bolts of linen were traded in the marketplace, and they were used as a form of currency in some transactions. The value of the linen was based on its quality and size. The fabric was a standard commodity in the economy. The bolts were a practical form of wealth. The lichen dye was one of the true dyes used on Egyptian textiles, and the color was a reddish purple that was highly valued. The dyeing process was complex, and the resulting color was considered a luxury. The use of the dye was a skilled craft. The color was a symbol of status. Wool was used for some garments, and the textile production in Egypt included the use of animal fibers alongside plant fibers. The wool was a secondary material compared to linen. The use of wool was a practical choice for warmth. The fabric was an alternative to the ubiquitous linen. The pin bezel was a simple fastener, and its use shows that the Egyptians had a practical approach to clothing construction. The pins were often made of metal, and they were a common accessory. The pins were a functional item. They were used for holding garments together. The disc pattern on royal robes was an elaborate decoration that required significant skill to produce. The discs were often made of gold or other precious metals. The pattern was a sign of royal authority. The decoration was a form of political symbolism. The heavy linen sails were essential for the ships that traveled the Nile, and the quality of the linen determined the reliability of the sail. The sails were a key component of maritime technology. The sails were an application of textile technology. The sails enabled trade and transport. The kilt was a versatile garment, and its length and style varied over the centuries. The kilt was a simple piece of cloth wrapped around the waist. The kilt was a practical and comfortable garment. The kilt was a standard part of the male wardrobe. The finest linen was reserved for the elite, and the fabric was often so fine that it was almost transparent. The quality of the linen was a clear indicator of the wearer's status. The finest linen was a mark of distinction. The quality of the cloth was carefully controlled. The doubled-over garment was a style that added bulk to the waist, and it was often seen in depictions of officials and high-status individuals. The style was a fashion choice that changed over time. The doubled-over style was a distinctive feature. The style was a marker of fashion. The colored textiles were less common than plain linen, and the use of pigments shows that the Egyptians had a variety of techniques for decorating fabric. The color could be applied in patterns or as a full coating. The colored cloth was a special item. The technique was a skill. The horizontal loom was a key piece of technology for textile production, and its use allowed for the mass production of linen cloth. The loom was a simple machine that was operated by a single person. The loom was a standard tool. The loom enabled the textile industry. The pleated garments required careful preparation, and the pleats were often created by folding the linen while it was damp and allowing it to dry. The pleats could be fine and closely spaced. The pleats were a skilled craft. The pleats were a decorative feature. The bolts of linen were made in a standard width and length, and the fabric was sold by the bolt in the marketplace. The standard size made the fabric easy to trade. The bolt was a commercial unit. The bolt was a common item in the marketplace. The lichen dye was imported from other regions, and the dye was a valuable trade good. The dye was a costly material. The import of the dye shows the reach of Egyptian trade networks. The dye was a luxury item. The use of wool for clothing was a practical choice for warmth, and the wool came from sheep and goats kept for their fiber. The wool was a secondary material compared to linen. The wool was used for warmer garments. The wool was a practical alternative. The pin bezel was a simple and effective fastener, and it was used for holding garments together. The pin was a practical tool for clothing. The pin was a common item. The pin was used in everyday life. The disc pattern on royal robes was made from valuable materials like gold and was a display of royal wealth. The pattern was a form of conspicuous consumption. The pattern was a symbol of power. The pattern was a sign of status. The heavy linen sails were essential for navigation, and the linen's strength and flexibility made it an ideal material. The sails were a product of textile technology. The sails were a key component of ships. The sails enabled the transportation of goods. The Egyptians domesticated a type of gazelle for food, though cattle remained the more common source of meat. The gazelle was smaller and easier to manage than cattle, and it was raised in enclosures for its meat and hide. The practice was widespread, and the animals were a regular part of the diet. The gazelle was a practical source of food for those who could not afford cattle. The common shrike, a small bird, was known as the butcher bird because of its habit of impaling insects on thorns. The bird would catch insects and then store them by pushing them onto sharp thorns for later consumption. The behavior was well known, and the bird was named for this gruesome habit. The term reflected a direct observation of nature. A type of mongoose was used to control rodents in grain stores, and the animal was a valuable assistant in protecting the harvest. The mongoose would hunt the rats and mice that infested the grain stores, keeping them from consuming the valuable food. The animal was kept for this practical purpose. The mongoose was a common sight in granaries. The Egyptian goose was a common bird, and it was kept for its meat and eggs. The bird was a familiar presence around farms and villages. The goose was a practical source of food. The bird was also a feature of the landscape. The tessim was a specific breed of dog, and it is depicted in art with a curled tail and pricked ears. The breed was used for hunting, and it was one of several types of dogs in ancient Egypt. The dog was a valued hunting companion. The breed appears in tomb paintings. The fat from a specific type of goat was used in various balms and ointments. The fat was rendered and mixed with other ingredients to create medicinal preparations. The goat fat was a common ingredient in traditional remedies. The use of the fat was a practical application of animal products. The ichneumon, a type of mongoose, was kept for its ability to kill snakes and rats. The animal was a valuable pest controller, and it was often kept in homes and granaries. The ichneumon was a practical solution to the problem of vermin. The animal was a useful companion. They hunted a type of antelope called the oryx for its hide, which was used for making leather and other goods. The oryx was a swift and wary animal, and hunting it required skill and patience. The hide was a valuable material. The hunt was a source of food and materials. A specific breed of sheep with a fatty tail was kept, and the tail was considered a delicacy. The fat from the tail was rendered and used in cooking, and the meat was a prized food. The sheep were valued for their fat and meat. The breed was a distinctive feature of Egyptian livestock. They had a term for a specific type of weevil that attacked stored grain, and the pest was a significant threat to the food supply. The weevil would infest the grain stores and consume the valuable food. The term for the weevil reflected the seriousness of the threat. The pest was a constant problem. Cattle were used for plowing and also for their milk and meat, and they were a central part of the agricultural economy. The oxen were yoked to plows and used to prepare the fields for planting. The cattle were a source of food and labor. The animals were essential to farming. A specific breed of donkey was known for its endurance, and it was used as a pack animal for long journeys. The donkey could carry heavy loads over long distances, and it was a reliable means of transport. The breed was valued for its strength and stamina. The donkey was a practical animal for travel. The fat from the goat was used in the production of cosmetics, and the balms were applied to the skin for their moisturizing properties. The fat was a common ingredient in beauty treatments. The use of the fat was a practical application of animal products. The balms were a standard part of personal care. The ichneumon was also known as the Pharaoh's rat, a name that reflected its role in pest control. The animal was a familiar sight in Egypt, and its ability to kill snakes was well known. The name was a descriptive label for the animal. The ichneumon was a useful creature. The oryx was hunted with dogs, and the hunt was a popular activity among the elite. The dogs would track and corner the oryx, and the hunters would then dispatch the animal with spears or arrows. The hunt was a sport as well as a source of food. The oryx was a challenging quarry. The sheep's tail fat was used in cooking, and the rendered fat was used for frying and as a flavoring. The fat was a valuable ingredient in the kitchen. The sheep were raised for their meat and fat. The tail fat was a prized part of the animal. The weevil was a persistent pest, and the Egyptians developed various methods for controlling the infestation. They would store grain in sealed containers and use natural repellents to keep the pests away. The weevil was a constant threat to the food supply. The methods for control were a practical response to the problem. Cattle were also used for their hides, which were tanned and used for leather goods. The hides were a valuable byproduct of cattle raising. The leather was used for sandals, belts, and other items. The cattle were a source of multiple materials. The donkey was used for transporting goods and people, and it was a common sight on the roads and in the fields. The donkey was a practical and reliable animal. The use of the donkey was widespread. The animal was an essential part of daily life. The Tessem dog appears in the tomb of Pharaoh Khufu, where a dog named Akbaru is depicted wearing a collar. The image shows that dogs were valued companions as well as hunting partners. The tomb depiction is a record of the breed. The dog was a familiar presence. The ichneumon was often depicted in art, and the animal was recognized for its role in controlling snakes. The image of the ichneumon appears in various contexts. The animal was a well-known creature. The ichneumon was a symbol of pest control. The oryx was also hunted for its meat, which was a valuable source of protein. The meat was consumed fresh or dried for later use. The oryx was a source of food. The hunt provided meat for the community. The sheep were a source of wool, which was used for clothing and other textiles. The wool was sheared from the sheep and spun into thread. The wool was a valuable fiber. The sheep were a source of multiple products. The weevil infestation was often severe, and the loss of grain to the pest was a significant economic problem. The Egyptians developed methods for storing grain to protect it from the weevil. The pest was a constant concern. The methods for control were a practical necessity. Cattle were also used for their milk, which was consumed fresh or turned into cheese and butter. The milk was a valuable source of nutrition. The cattle were a source of food. The dairy products were a standard part of the diet. The donkey was used for carrying water and other supplies, and it was an essential part of the infrastructure. The donkey was a practical and hard-working animal. The use of the donkey was essential. The animal was a key part of daily life. The Tessem dog was a hunting dog, and it was used to track and catch game. The dog was a valued hunting partner. The breed was known for its speed and agility. The dog was a practical tool for hunting. The ichneumon was valued for its ability to kill snakes, and the animal was a practical solution to a dangerous problem. The mongoose would hunt and kill snakes, protecting people and livestock. The animal was a valuable ally. The ichneumon was a useful creature. The oryx was a fast and graceful animal, and its image appears in Egyptian art. The animal was admired for its beauty and speed. The oryx was a symbol of grace. The image of the oryx was a common motif. The sheep were a source of meat and fat, and the animals were a staple of the Egyptian diet. The sheep were raised for their food value. The meat was consumed regularly. The sheep were a key part of the food supply. The weevil was a destructive pest, and its presence in grain stores was a sign of poor storage. The Egyptians took steps to prevent infestations. The weevil was a constant threat. The prevention was a practical concern. Cattle were a measure of wealth, and the number of cattle a person owned indicated their status. The cattle were a valuable asset. The ownership of cattle was a sign of prosperity. The cattle were a store of value. The donkey was a symbol of humility and hard work, and the animal was a familiar presence. The donkey was a practical and unassuming animal. The use of the donkey was widespread. The animal was a familiar part of life. The Tessem dog appears in inscriptions from the Middle Kingdom, and the breed was known for its hunting abilities. The dog was a valued companion. The breed appears in tomb paintings. The Tessem was a well-known breed. The ichneumon was kept as a pet in some households, and the animal was valued for its affectionate nature. The mongoose was a useful and companionable animal. The pet was a source of comfort. The ichneumon was a valued member of the household. The oryx was a symbol of the desert, and the animal represented the wildness of the frontier. The oryx was a creature of the open spaces. The image of the oryx was a symbol of the desert. The animal was a reminder of the wilderness. The Egyptians recognized a group of stars called the imperishable ones, which were the circumpolar stars that never set below the horizon. These stars were always visible in the northern sky, and their constant presence made them reliable markers for orientation. The term imperishable reflected their eternal visibility. The stars were a constant presence in the night sky. The hieroglyph for star was a five-pointed shape inside a circle, a simple and recognizable symbol. The design was used in inscriptions to represent celestial bodies and the concept of the night sky. The symbol was a common element in astronomical texts. The shape was practical and easy to carve. They divided the night into 24 parts, based on the rising of certain stars, creating a system of hour markers that changed with the seasons. The stars would rise at different times throughout the year, and the Egyptians tracked these risings to keep time at night. The system was based on direct observation. The hour markers were essential for scheduling nighttime activities. They had a specific term for the setting of the sun, referring to it as a time of day called Kepru. The term described the moment when the sun disappeared below the horizon. The word was part of the vocabulary of timekeeping. The setting sun was a marker of the transition from day to night. The star Sirius was known as Sopdet, and its rising marked the beginning of the calendar year, though the calendar had no leap year until later. The heliacal rising of Sirius, appearing just before dawn, signaled the start of the flood season. The event was a crucial marker in the annual cycle. The calendar was tied to this astronomical event. They had a concept of a tortoise constellation, though it is not the same as our modern one. The constellation was one of several that the Egyptians identified in the night sky. The identification of these constellations is difficult for modern scholars. The ancient system was different from our own. They used the position of the sun at noon to determine south, a practical method for orientation. The sun's shadow at midday would point north, allowing travelers and builders to determine the cardinal directions. The method was simple and effective. The practice was a standard navigational technique. They had instruments, like the merket, to measure the alignment of stars with a plumb line. The merket was a wooden bar with a plumb line, used to establish a north-south axis. The instrument was a key tool for astronomical observation. The merket allowed for precise measurements. They named the months after agricultural events, not after celestial bodies, linking the calendar to the rhythm of the land. The months were tied to the flood, planting and harvest seasons. The names reflected the agricultural cycle. The calendar was a practical tool for farming. They knew the length of the year was about 365 days, but ignored the extra quarter day for a long period. The civil calendar had 365 days, and it would slowly drift through the seasons. The drifting was a known phenomenon, but not corrected for centuries. The calendar was a fixed system. They had a specific name for the Milky Way, referring to it as the Nile of the sky. The band of stars was seen as a celestial river, mirroring the earthly Nile. The name reflected the importance of the river in Egyptian life. The Milky Way was a familiar feature of the night sky. They observed the planet Jupiter but gave it a specific name related to its appearance, such as Horus who binds the two lands. The planet was noted for its brightness and movement. The name was descriptive, not mythological. The observation of planets was part of their astronomical practice. The decans were 36 specific stars or constellations that rose on the horizon in succession every 10 days. The decans were used to track the hours of the night, and their risings were recorded in star tables. The system was a sophisticated method of timekeeping. The Book of Nut was a complex composition concerning celestial phenomena, describing the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. The text was a major astronomical work, and it provided a framework for understanding the cosmos. The book existed in multiple versions. The content was a significant achievement. The astronomical ceilings in tombs and temples often depicted the sky, with the goddess Nut represented as the vault of heaven. The ceilings were decorated with constellations and astronomical symbols. The depictions were a standard feature of royal tombs. The ceiling art was a form of astronomical record. The sundial was used to measure time during the day, and the shadow cast by the gnomon would fall on a marked surface. The sundial was a practical tool for tracking the sun's movement. The time was measured by the shadow's position. The instrument was a standard part of timekeeping. The water clock was used for measuring time at night, and it was calibrated to account for the changing length of the hours throughout the year. The water clock was a more reliable method for nighttime measurement. The clock was a significant technological achievement. The Egyptian calendar had 3 seasons: Akhet, inundation; Peret, sowing, and Shemu, harvest. The seasons were each 4 months long, and the year ended with 5 extra days. The calendar was a fixed structure for the year. The seasons were aligned with the agricultural cycle. The planet Venus was observed and given a name that reflected its appearance as both a morning and evening star, such as the intersecting star. The planet was noted for its brightness and was a familiar object in the sky. The name was descriptive, not mythological. The star Sirius was the most important star for timing the annual flood, and its rising was a major event in the Egyptian calendar. The appearance of Sirius was the signal for the start of the inundation. The event was central to Egyptian agriculture. The star was a key marker of time. The observation of stars was essential for determining the hours of the night, and the star clocks provided a practical method for this. The star clocks were a tool for scheduling nocturnal activities. The clocks were a practical application of astronomy. The Egyptians recognized at least 5 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The planets were distinguished from the fixed stars by their movement. The knowledge of the planets was a part of Egyptian astronomy. The imperishable stars were used for orientation, as they always remained in the same position in the night sky. The stars were a fixed reference point for navigation. The use of the stars was a practical application of astronomy. The decans were also used to create a system of timekeeping that eventually influenced the development of the 24-hour day. The system of decans was a significant contribution to the history of time measurement. The decanal system was an early form of timekeeping. The star tables were often placed on the ceilings of tombs, and they provided a map of the night sky for the deceased. The tables were a form of astronomical record. The placement of the tables was a practice in funerary architecture. The priests were responsible for observing the stars, and they were expected to know the movements of the celestial bodies. The observation of the sky was a formal practice. The priests were the keepers of astronomical knowledge. The orientation of the pyramids was aligned with the cardinal points, and the builders used the stars to achieve this alignment. The alignment was a precise construction method. The use of astronomy was essential to the process. The decans were a system of 36 stars that marked the passage of time, and they were a central feature of Egyptian astronomy. The decans were a unique feature of Egyptian timekeeping. The system was a practical method of marking the hours. The imperishable stars were the circumpolar stars that never set, and they were a constant presence in the night sky. The stars were a reliable reference for orientation. The use of the stars was a key part of Egyptian astronomy. The observation of the sun's position at noon was a method for determining the cardinal direction south. The shadow of a vertical stick would point north at noon. The method was a simple but effective technique. The technique was a standard navigational tool. The title Overseer of the Cattle was a significant administrative post, and the position involved managing the herds that were a crucial part of the agricultural economy. The overseer would be responsible for the health and breeding of the cattle, as well as their distribution for labor and food. The title was often held by high-ranking officials. The management of cattle was a major responsibility. They had a specific term for a professional mourner at funerals, and these individuals were hired to perform the rituals of grief and lamentation. The mourners would wail and beat their breasts in a display of sorrow, adding to the solemnity of the occasion. The professional mourners were a standard part of funeral processions. The role was a recognized profession. The chief of the artisans was a high-ranking official in charge of all royal workshops, and the position involved overseeing the production of everything from furniture to jewelry to statues. The chief would manage the craftsmen and the flow of materials. The workshop was a complex operation requiring careful organization. The chief was a key figure in the production of royal goods. A specific type of soldier known as the mahor existed, likely a charioteer who fought from a horse-drawn chariot. The charioteers were an elite fighting force, and they were trained in the use of the bow and spear from their moving platforms. The mahor were a significant military unit. The chariot was a decisive weapon in battle. The profession of beekeeper existed, and honey was a major trade good used for sweetening, medicine, and offerings. The beekeepers would manage the hives and harvest the honey, which was then stored in jars for later use. The profession required skill and knowledge of the bees. The honey was a valuable commodity. They had a system of pay for laborers based on rations of grain and beer, and the workers would receive their wages in kind. The grain and beer were the standard currency for the working class, and the amount varied depending on the type of work. The system was a practical method of payment. The workers were compensated for their labor. The treasurer was one of the highest non-royal officials, and the position involved managing the state's wealth and resources. The treasurer would oversee the collection of taxes and the distribution of funds. The role was essential to the functioning of the government. The treasurer was a powerful figure. They had a specific name for a sandal maker, indicating a specialized trade that was important for everyday life. The sandal maker would craft sandals from leather or plant fibers, and the shoes were a necessity for protection from the hot ground. The profession was a standard craft in the community. The sandal maker was a skilled artisan. The butcher had a distinct status for meat offerings, and the role was connected to the ritual preparation of animals for consumption and for temple use. The butcher would slaughter the animals and prepare the meat for distribution. The profession was a practical and significant role. The butcher was an essential part of the food supply chain. There was a specific type of official known as the keeper of the king's linen, who was responsible for the royal wardrobe. The keeper would manage the storage, cleaning, and distribution of the king's garments. The position was one of trust and proximity to the ruler. The keeper was a high-ranking servant. They had a specific term for a shipbuilder, and the profession was vital for the construction of boats and ships for the Nile and the Mediterranean. The shipbuilder would work with wood and other materials to create vessels for trade and travel. The skill was passed down through generations. The shipbuilder was a key craftsman. The scribe of the army was a distinct role in the military hierarchy, responsible for administrative tasks and record-keeping within the military. The scribe would manage the accounts, supplies, and troop numbers. The position was essential for the logistics of the army. The scribe was a key support role. The title overseer of the cattle of Ammon was a specific and prestigious position, and the cattle were a major source of wealth for the temple. The herds were used for offerings and for their products. The role involved managing the temple's cattle estates. The herds were a significant economic asset. The great overseer of the cattle in the temple of Usermatra Setapenre was a title held by officials like Ptahemwea, who managed the cattle for the Ramesseum. The herds provided the meat and fat for the temple's offerings. The title was a mark of significant administrative responsibility. The position was a key part of temple administration. The chief of the artisans title was also connected to the high priest of Ptah at Memphis, who was described as the chief of the artisans. This title reflected the connection between the creator god Ptah and the work of craftsmen. The role was a high-ranking religious and administrative position. The title was a mark of status. The Egyptian army's scribes were also involved in building projects, and they had to calculate the rations for the workmen and the size of the workforce needed for a task. The scribes were responsible for the logistical planning of large-scale construction. The role required mathematical and organizational skills. The scribes were essential for the project. The title King's Scribe was a common one, and it indicated an official who could read and write on behalf of the king. The scribe would be involved in all levels of administration, from accounting to diplomacy. The role was central to the functioning of the state. The scribe was a key figure in Egyptian society. The overseer of the granary was another essential administrative role, and the position involved managing the state's grain stores. The granary was a key part of the economy, and the overseer would track the inflows and outflows of grain. The position was a significant responsibility. The granary was a vital resource. The title, Chief of the Stalls of His Majesty, referred to a person who managed the king's stables, a role that involved the care and training of horses for the chariotry. The stables were a key military asset, and their management was a position of trust. The role was a key part of the military infrastructure. The title Overseer of the Southern Foreign Lands was a title held by the Viceroy of Kush, who was the main administrator of the Nubian provinces. The Viceroy was a high-ranking official responsible for the governance of the southern territories. The role was a key part of the Egyptian administration. The chief workman, was a well-known official, and his title indicates his role as the leader of a crew of workmen at Deir el-Medina. He was the head of the craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The title was a position of authority over the tomb builders. The role was essential to the funerary industry. The overseer of works of the two lands was a high-ranking title, and the position was so prestigious that it was listed above the royal scribe of the palace. The overseer of works was responsible for the major construction projects of the state. The role was a significant administrative post. The position was a mark of status. The overseer of the workshops of Amun was a role held by an individual named Pashadu, who rose from a simple servant in the place of truth to this high-ranking position. The title indicates he was the head of the workshops attached to the Temple of Amun. The role was a significant administrative position. The scribe of the army is attested in texts from as early as the 5th dynasty, indicating the long history of the military scribal profession. The scribes were essential for the record-keeping and administration of the military. The role was a key part of the Egyptian bureaucracy. The scribe was a vital support for the army. The title, Overseer of the Treasury, was a key financial role, and the position involved managing the state's wealth and resources. The treasurer would oversee the collection of taxes and the distribution of funds. The role was essential to the functioning of the government. The treasurer was a powerful figure. The overseer of craftsmen was a title held by Nespower Shefet, who was a high-ranking official at the Temple of Karnak. His principal roles were supervisor of craftsmen's workshops and supervisor of scribes in the House of Amun. The title indicates a significant administrative role. The position was a mark of prestige. The beekeeper was a profession that appears in various contexts, and the honey was a major trade good. The beekeeper would manage the hives and harvest the honey, which was then stored in jars for later use. The profession required skill and knowledge of the bees. The honey was a valuable commodity. The butcher was a key figure in the preparation of meat, and the role was a specialized craft. The butcher would slaughter the animals and prepare the meat for distribution. The profession was a practical and significant role. The butcher was an essential part of the food supply chain. The sandal maker was a specialized craftsperson, and the profession involved making sandals from leather or plant fibers. The sandals were a necessity for protection from the hot ground. The profession was a standard craft in the community. The sandal maker was a skilled artisan. The keeper of the king's linen was an official position, and the role was one of trust and proximity to the ruler. The keeper would manage the king's wardrobe, a significant responsibility. The position was a mark of status and trust. The shipbuilder was a key craftsman, and the role involved constructing boats and ships. The skill was passed down through generations. The shipbuilder was a vital part of the economy and the military. The profession was a significant trade. The scribe of the army had to have a range of skills, including the ability to calculate rations and manage logistics. The scribe was a key part of the military administration. The role required training and precision. The scribe was a vital part of the army's structure. The chief of the artisans was a high official, and the position involved overseeing the production of goods in the royal workshops. The role was a significant administrative post. The chief was a key figure in the production of royal goods. The position was a mark of high status. The staples of the Egyptian diet were bread and beer, and these two foods formed the foundation of every meal for both rich and poor alike. The bread was made almost exclusively from emmer wheat, while the beer was brewed from barley and was thick and nutritious. The two were so central to daily life that they were often used as a form of payment for workers. The diet was built around these basic elements. A common meal included bread, beer, and onions, and this simple combination was the standard fare for most working people. The onions were often eaten raw, and they provided flavor and nutrients to an otherwise plain diet. The meal was quick and easy to prepare. The combination was a reliable source of sustenance. The beer was thick and cloudy, more like a gruel than a modern beverage, and it was an important source of nutrition rather than just a drink. It was rich in protein, minerals, and vitamins, and it was consumed daily by men, women, and children. The beer was a food as much as a drink. The beverage was a staple of the diet. They cultivated a type of melon in the fertile valley, and the fruit was a welcome addition to the diet during the summer months. The melons were grown in the rich soil left by the flood, and they were eaten fresh or used in dishes. The melons were a seasonal treat. The fruit was a source of hydration and sweetness. The word for bread was tea, and there were dozens of types of bread produced by the bakers. The varieties included flat loaves, conical loaves, and loaves shaped like animals and human figures. The bread could be flavored with coriander seeds or dates, though it is not known if the poor had access to these additions. The variety of bread was remarkable. Dates were used as a sweetener, and both fresh and dried dates were consumed regularly. The dates were high in sugar and provided a quick source of energy. They were often eaten as a snack or used in desserts. The dates were a staple fruit. They imported olive oil, but it was never as common as local vegetable oils made from lettuce seed, radish seed, or sesame. The imported oil was expensive and reserved for the wealthy. The local oils were used for cooking and as a base for ointments. The olive oil was a luxury item. They hunted wildfowl for meat, using a throwing stick or a net to capture the birds. The ducks, geese, and other birds were abundant in the marshes along the Nile. The wildfowl were a source of protein for those who could not afford domesticated meat. The hunt was a common activity. The pulp of the dom palm fruit was used in confections, and the nut was eaten raw or steeped to make juice. The fruit was a common ingredient in sweets and desserts. The dom palm was a versatile plant. The fruit was a useful food. They made a type of cheese from sheep's milk, and the cheese was likely soft and similar to cottage cheese. The cheese was a source of protein and was consumed by those who could afford it. The cheese was a valuable food. The production of cheese was a specialized craft. They ate a variety of fish, but some species were avoided due to local custom or association with certain places. The fish were caught in the Nile and its canals, and they were a common source of protein. The fish were eaten fresh or dried and salted. The fish were a staple of the diet. Garlic and leeks were used as flavorings in many dishes, and both also had medicinal uses. The garlic was eaten raw or cooked, and it added a pungent flavor to stews and soups. The leeks were a common vegetable. The flavorings were an essential part of cooking. The beer was brewed using a process that involved baking a lightly leavened beer bread, which was then crumbled and fermented. The bread was made with barley or emmer wheat, and it was baked just enough to set the yeast. The bread was then mixed with water and left to ferment. The process was a form of early biotechnology. The onions were long-shooted green scallions, and they were a common accompaniment to bread and beer. The onions were eaten raw, and they added a sharp flavor to the meal. The onions were a reliable crop. The scallions were a staple vegetable. The grapes were eaten fresh or dried as raisins, and they were also used to make wine for the wealthy. The grapes grew well in the Egyptian climate, and they were a common fruit. The raisins were a portable snack. The grapes were a versatile fruit. The lentils and chickpeas were vital sources of protein, especially for the poor who could not afford meat. The legumes were used in stews and soups, and they provided essential nutrients. The legumes were a staple of the diet. The pulses were a reliable food source. The bread was baked in a variety of ovens, including heavy pottery molds in the Old Kingdom and cylindrical clay ovens in the New Kingdom. The dough was slapped on the heated inner wall of the oven to bake. The baking techniques evolved over time. The ovens were a key part of food preparation. The dates were sometimes used to ferment wine, and the poor would use them as sweeteners because honey was expensive. The date wine was a cheaper alternative to grape wine. The dates were a versatile fruit. The sweeteners were a valuable commodity. The fish were often preserved by salting and drying, and the salted fish was a popular food. The preserved fish could be stored for long periods and was a valuable food source. The salted fish was a common item. The preservation method was effective. The cheese was made from goat's milk or sheep's milk, and the cheese was a source of protein. The cheese was a valuable food. The production of cheese was a specialized craft. The cheese was a staple of the diet. The garlic was used both as a food and as a medicine, and it was a common ingredient in remedies. The garlic was believed to have health benefits. The garlic was a useful plant. The garlic was a staple of the diet. The leeks were a common vegetable, and they were eaten raw or cooked. The leeks were a flavorful addition to meals. The leeks were a staple of the diet. The leeks were a versatile vegetable. The bread could be made with barley as well as emmer, and barley was also used for making beer. The barley was a versatile grain. The barley was a staple of the diet. The barley was a key crop. The dom palm nuts were a common fruit, and they were eaten raw or used to make juice. The nuts were a source of nutrition. The dom palm was a useful plant. The nuts were a valuable food. The olive oil was imported from the Middle East, and the pottery vessels used to store it have been found at Giza. The oil was a luxury import. The oil was used for cooking and cosmetics. The olive oil was a valuable commodity. The wildfowl were captured with nets and clapnets, and they were a common source of meat. The birds were abundant in the marshes. The wildfowl were a valuable food source. The hunting was a skilled activity. The dates were a common fruit, and they were eaten fresh or dried. The dates were a source of energy. The dates were a staple of the diet. The dates were a versatile fruit. The fish were caught with nets and rods, and they were a common source of protein. The fish were abundant in the Nile. The fish were a staple of the diet. The fishing was a common activity. The cheese was a valuable food, and it was made from sheep's or goat's milk. The cheese was a source of protein. The cheese was a staple of the diet. The cheese was a valuable food. The garlic and leeks were common vegetables, and they were used to flavor many dishes. The garlic and leeks were a staple of the diet. The garlic and leeks were essential ingredients. A bow drill was used to start fires and to drill beads, and this simple tool was a cornerstone of many crafts. The drill consisted of a wooden shaft rotated by a bow, and the friction generated heat for fire making, or the abrasive action for cutting holes. The bow drill was a versatile tool that appears in many craft contexts. The device was a practical solution to multiple problems. Stone vessels were made using a drill with a tubular bit, allowing the craftsman to hollow out the interior with precision. The tubular bit was rotated to cut a core from the stone, which was then removed to create the cavity. The technique was used for making vases and other containers. The process was a specialized skill. They used a specific type of adhesive made from animal glue and tree resin to bond wood and other materials. The glue was heated and applied to the surfaces to be joined, and the bond would set as it cooled. The adhesive was a standard material in the workshop. The glue was a reliable bonding agent. The chisel was used with a wooden mallet, not a metal hammer, to strike the tool and cut the stone or wood. The wooden mallet absorbed the shock of the blow and allowed for more controlled cutting. The technique was a standard practice in carving. The mallet was a common tool in the workshop. A two-man saw was used for cutting large blocks of stone, and the saw would be pulled back and forth by two workers to cut a groove in the material. The saw was a heavy tool that required coordination to use effectively. The two-man saw was a key tool for quarrying and construction. The saw was essential for cutting large blocks. The craftsman could polish stone to a high finish using a series of fine abrasive sands, which were applied with a rubbing stone to smooth the surface. The process involved using progressively finer grits to achieve a glossy sheen. The polished surface was a mark of quality in stoneworking. The finishing process was a skilled craft. Glass beads were made, but the glass was opaque and colored rather than transparent. The glass was produced by heating silica and other ingredients to high temperatures. The resulting beads were a common form of decoration. The beads were a product of a sophisticated glass-making industry. The jeweler used a bow drill to cut gems and to set them, allowing for the creation of intricate jewelry. The drill was used to bore holes in beads and to create settings for precious stones. The bow drill was an essential tool for the jeweler. The tool allowed for precision work. They had a specific type of potter's wheel, used from the Middle Kingdom onward, which was a low turntable that allowed the potter to shape vessels more efficiently. The wheel was a simple device that had a significant impact on pottery production. The introduction of the wheel is a key technological development. The wheel allowed for more uniform vessels. They used a form of lathe to turn wooden objects, and the lathe was used to create cylindrical shapes for furniture and other items. The lathe was a tool for shaping wood by rotating it against a cutting tool. The use of the lathe allowed for precision work in wood turning. The lathe was a significant tool for the carpenter. They had a specific type of clamp for holding wood while carving, and the clamp would secure the workpiece to the workbench. The clamp allowed the craftsman to work with both hands free. The clamp was a standard workshop tool. The clamp was essential for detailed work. They used a type of saw with a curved blade for cutting curved lines, which allowed for more intricate designs in woodworking. The curved blade could follow a pattern to create decorative edges. The saw was a specialized tool for the carpenter. The tool allowed for intricate shapes. The bow drill was equipped with a variety of drill bits, including flint tips for working stone and wood. The bits were made from hard stones like chert or flint. The interchangeable bits allowed the same drill to be used for different materials. The bow drill was a versatile tool. The two-man saw was known as a fret saw in some contexts, and it was used for cutting stone blocks that were too large for a single person to handle. The saw would be pulled back and forth by two workers. The technique was a standard method for quarrying. The saw was a large and heavy tool. The polishing process for stone involved using a series of abrasive sands, from coarse to very fine, and the final polish was achieved with a smooth stone and water. The process was labor-intensive but produced a high-quality finish. The polished stone was a mark of craftsmanship. The technique was used on statues and other objects. The glass beads were made by winding molten glass around a wire or by drawing it into rods and cutting it into pieces. The process was a skilled craft. The beads were a popular form of decoration. The beads were a product of a sophisticated glass-making industry. The jeweler's tools were often small and delicate, and the bow drill was used for fine work like drilling holes in beads and setting stones. The tool was used with great precision. The jeweler's craft required skill and patience. The potter's wheel was a simple turntable with a lower pivot stone that turned within a socketed stone embedded in the ground. The rotation was aided by lubrication. The wheel was a significant technological advance. The wheel allowed for more efficient pottery production. The lathe was used to create round tenon joints, and examples of this technique have been found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The tenon joint was a key part of Egyptian furniture making. The lathe allowed for the creation of precise cylindrical shapes. The technique was an advanced woodworking skill. The clamp for holding wood was often made from a wooden frame with wedges to secure the piece. The clamp was a simple but effective device. The clamp allowed the craftsman to work on the piece with both hands. The clamp was a standard workshop tool. The curved saw was a specialized tool for cutting curves in wood, and it was used for creating decorative elements. The saw had a thin blade that could be guided along a pattern. The saw was a tool for the skilled craftsman. The tool was used for intricate work. The flint drills used for bead making were small and delicate, and they were set into wooden handles for use. The flint would be napped to a sharp point for cutting. The drills were a key part of the bead-making industry. The drills were used to create holes for stringing the beads. The adhesive made from animal glue was produced by boiling animal hides and connective tissues. The glue was used for a variety of purposes. The glue was a standard material in the workshop. The adhesive was a reliable bonding agent. The chisels used for woodworking were often made of copper or bronze, and they were sharpened on a sandstone slab. The sharpening was essential for effective cutting. The chisel was a key tool for the carpenter. The chisel was used for fine detail work. The two-man saw was made of a long blade with a handle at each end, and the saw would be used to cut stone blocks. The saw was a heavy tool that required coordination. The saw was a standard tool in the quarry. The saw was used for large-scale cutting. The bead-making industry was a major craft in ancient Egypt, and the beads were produced in a variety of materials including glass, stone, and faience. The beads were used for jewelry and decoration. The beads were a common item of trade. The industry was a significant part of the economy. The lathe was a relatively rare tool, and its use was limited to skilled craftsmen. The lathe allowed for the production of high-quality wooden objects. The lathe was a significant tool for the carpenter. The clamp was a simple but essential workshop tool for holding workpieces. The clamp was used in both stone and wood carving. The clamp was a standard piece of equipment. The clamp allowed for more precise work. The curved saw was a key tool for creating the intricate shapes found in Egyptian furniture. The saw was used for decorative carving. The saw was a specialist tool. The saw was a key part of the woodworker's toolkit. The bow drill was a versatile tool that was used for drilling, boring, and fire making. The tool was a key part of the craftsman's equipment. The bow drill was a simple but effective device. The tool was used in many different crafts. The polishing of stone was a skilled craft that required time and patience. The polishing produced a smooth and reflective surface. The polished stone was a mark of high quality. The technique was used for statues and other objects. The oasis of Dakhla has a specific water supply that supports agriculture even today, and this water comes from underground aquifers that are replenished by rainfall in distant highlands. The water rises to the surface through natural springs, creating pockets of green in the middle of the desert. The oasis has been inhabited for thousands of years, and its water sources have been carefully managed. The presence of water in such a dry region is a rare and valuable resource. They mined turquoise in the Sinai Peninsula, in a place called Serabit el Khadim, and this site was one of the most important mining regions in antiquity. The turquoise was a prized stone, and its distinctive blue-green color was highly valued for jewelry and decoration. The mines were operated for centuries, and the site was visited by expedition parties led by Egyptian kings. The turquoise trade was a significant part of the economy. They sent expeditions to Wadi Hammamat for stone called beken and gold, and this wadi was a major source of valuable materials. The stone, a gray-green siltstone, was used for making statues and other prestige objects. The gold was mined from the quartz veins that ran through the hills of the region. The expeditions were organized by the state and often involved hundreds of workers. The Fayum oasis was not a natural oasis in the strict sense. They regulated the water flow with an elaborate canal system that diverted water from the Nile. The Ba Youssef Canal carried water from the Nile Valley into the Fayum Depression, which then spread through a network of smaller canals. This allowed for year-round agriculture in a region that would otherwise be desert. The water management system was a major engineering achievement. A standard caravan took roughly 20 to 30 days to reach Nubia, and the journeys were carefully planned and supplied for the long desert crossing. The caravans would carry water and food for the journey, and the pace was set by the endurance of the donkeys. The trip was a significant undertaking, requiring careful preparation and organization. The caravan route was a well-established trade artery. They used donkeys as pack animals, not camels, and the donkey was the standard beast of burden for overland transport. The camel was a later introduction to Egypt, and it did not become widely used until much later in history. The donkey was a hardy animal that could carry heavy loads over long distances. The donkey was essential for desert travel and trade. The term for an expedition was Haiti, meaning going forth, and this word was used for any organized journey, whether for trade, mining, or military purposes. The term reflected the active and purposeful nature of these ventures. The expeditions were a regular feature of Egyptian administration. The word was part of the vocabulary of travel and organization. They had specific desert guides who knew the safe routes, and these guides were essential for navigating the trackless wilderness. The guides knew the location of water sources and the safest paths through the rocky terrain. Their knowledge was passed down through families and was a valuable skill. The guides were a key part of any desert journey. They built mud brick forts along the desert routes for protection, and these forts served as way stations for travelers and as defensive outposts. The forts provided shelter and supplies for passing caravans, and they were often garrisoned by soldiers. The forts were a visible sign of state control over the desert routes. They were a practical measure for security. The green oasis was often the destination for a well-known variety of produce, and the oases were a source of fresh fruits and vegetables for the surrounding region. The produce was highly prized and was often sent to the Nile Valley as a luxury item. The oases were a productive agricultural area. The crops were a valuable trade good. They used a specific type of boat to transport heavy stone blocks along the Nile, and the barges were designed to carry the massive loads. The boats were constructed from wood and were capable of carrying blocks weighing many tons. The barges were essential for moving the stone from the quarries to the construction sites. The boat was a key tool for construction. They mined amethyst in the eastern desert at Wadi el-Hudi, and this site was a major source of the purple quartz for making jewelry. The mines were operated during the Middle Kingdom by large expeditions that included soldiers and laborers. The amethyst was a valuable stone for jewelry. The mines were a significant economic operation. The turquoise mines at Serabit el-Qadim were worked by prisoners of war and specialized workers, and the site had a temple and several chapels dedicated to the expeditions. The workers lived in camps near the mines and endured harsh conditions. The site's temple was a center for the activities of the mining community. The mines were a major state enterprise. The Fayum region was developed for agriculture, and the region's fertility was a major source of wealth. The land was transformed by irrigation into a productive agricultural area. The region was a garden in the midst of the desert. The irrigation was a key feature of the landscape. The desert guides were known as hru, a term that literally means those who are upon the way. The guides were a recognized profession, and their knowledge was essential for the success of any expedition. The term reflected their role in navigating the difficult terrain. The guides were a key part of desert travel. The forts along the desert route were often square or rectangular in plan and had thick walls for defense. The forts were constructed of mud brick, which was the standard building material in the Nile Valley. The forts were a visible presence in the landscape. The forts were a sign of state authority. The stone blocks for the temples and pyramids were transported during the flood season, when the Nile's high water made it easier to float the heavy barges. The river would rise to cover the banks, bringing the barges closer to the quarry sites. The timing of the transport was carefully planned. The flood season was the key time for stone transport. The amethyst mining at Wadi el-Hudi involved over 1,000 laborers, and the sites were well-organized settlements with administrative areas and workspaces. The work was hard, but the amethyst was a highly valued commodity. The settlements were carefully planned. The mining was a major industry. The Wadi Hammamat expeditions were led by high officials, who would leave inscriptions at the site to record their success. These inscriptions were a form of official record and a way of commemorating the achievement. The inscriptions provide a record of the expedition's scale. They are a record of the state's activities. The Fayum region was known for its fruit, and the region's produce was a major source of wealth for the Egyptian state. The fruit was a luxury item. The produce was a key export from the region. The region was a major agricultural center. The turquoise was a semi-precious stone that was highly prized by the Egyptians, and it was used for making jewelry and inlays. The blue-green color was associated with the sky and the water. The turquoise was a valuable trade commodity. The stone was a symbol of the desert. The desert edge was a zone of controlled exploitation, and the expeditions to the mines and quarries were carefully managed by the state. The oases were key centers for agriculture and trade. The region was an essential part of the Egyptian economy. The exploitation of the desert was a major state activity. The first known strike in recorded history occurred in the village of Deir el-Medina, and this event took place during the reign of Ramses III. The workers who were building the royal tombs stopped their labor because their rations of grain and beer had been delayed. They refused to work until their wages were paid, a protest that was documented in the administrative records. The strike was a secular labor dispute recorded in papyrus. The oldest known preserved dress is from Egypt, and this garment is about 5,000 years old. It was discovered in an early tomb and is made of linen with pleated details. The dress is considered one of the oldest examples of woven clothing. The preservation was due to the dry conditions of the desert environment. A record of a solar eclipse appears on a tomb inscription from the 14th century BCE. The text mentions that the sky was dark during the day, which is a description consistent with a solar eclipse. The inscription was found on a tomb in the Theban necropolis. The event was recorded as a notable occurrence. The first recorded treaty in history is from the Battle of Kadesh, which was fought between the Egyptians and the Hittites. The treaty was written in both Egyptian and Hittite, and it established a peace agreement between the two empires. The text was recorded on clay tablets and on the walls of Egyptian temples. The treaty was a secular political document. The oldest known gymnasium from a Greek-Egyptian context dates to the 3rd century BCE. The gymnasium was a building used for athletic training and education, and it was a key institution in the Greek cities of Egypt. The example is located in a settlement that was established after the conquest of Alexander. The gymnasium was a secular center for physical and intellectual activity. The largest known bronze statue from antiquity was of a pharaoh, though mostly broken up now. The statue was a colossal figure that was likely over 15 meters tall. It was dismantled and reused for other purposes in later periods. The fragments are the only evidence of its original size. The first known world map is Egyptian, a map of the underworld that is also a secular depiction of areas. The map is a detailed diagram of a specific area in the tomb of Ramses IV. It shows the location of his tomb and the surrounding landscape. The map was a practical tool for the tomb builders. The final known inscription using hieroglyphic writing was made in 394 CE at Philae. The inscription was found on a temple wall and was a dedication to the Roman emperor. It was the last time the traditional script was used. The writing system had persisted for thousands of years. The oldest known shipment of stone is recorded in a papyrus listing delivery dates for a specific construction project. The document itemizes the number of blocks, the quarry they came from, and the date they were shipped. The log provides a record of the logistics of stone transport. The papyrus was found at the site of a royal building project. The annual inundation was first recorded in writing in a specific year on the Palermo stone, which is a record of the kings and their reigns. The Palermo stone is a fragmentary slab of black basalt that lists the kings and the major events of their rule. The stone includes notes about the Nile flood levels. The record was a formal administrative document. The workers at Deir el-Medina went on strike multiple times, and these events were documented because they disrupted the work on the royal tombs. The records note that the workers refused to work, and they would not return until their pay arrived. The labor protests were a recurring issue. The records provide a valuable insight into the workers' conditions. The dress that is 5,000 years old was discovered in a tomb at Tarkhan, and the garment is now in the Petrie Museum. The dress was found with a full set of jewelry. The dress is a rare and important find. The garment is a key piece of evidence of ancient clothing. The solar eclipse was recorded in the 14th century BCE and has been used by modern astronomers to date the event with precision. The inscription is a specific and verifiable astronomical observation. The eclipse provides a fixed date for the tomb owner's reign. The record is a key piece of evidence. The Treaty of Kadesh was recorded in 2 languages, and the tablets are now in museums in Istanbul and Berlin. The treaty is a historical document that established a boundary between the 2 empires. The treaty was a formal agreement between 2 major states. The document is a key source for the study of international relations. The Egyptian maps of the underworld were a form of guidebook for the deceased, but they are also a secular depiction of the terrain. The maps show the exact location of features within the tomb structure. The maps were a practical tool for the builders. The maps are a unique form of cartography. The hieroglyphic inscription at Philae was a dedication in the local temple, and the text was written in the traditional script. The inscription marks the end of a continuous written tradition. The date is a significant marker in the history of writing. The stone shipment papyrus is a record of the logistics of moving blocks from a quarry to a temple site. The document is a specific example of administrative record keeping. The papyrus is a detailed and practical record. The document provides a case study of state logistics. The Palermo stone was broken into several fragments, and most of the pieces are now in museums. The stone is a key source for the chronology of the early kings. The text lists the annual inundation levels. The stone is a fundamental piece of evidence for Egyptian history. The Deir el-Medina workers were skilled craftsmen, and their protests were a sign that they were aware of their value. They would stop working when their pay was late. The strikes were a negotiating tactic. The Tarkhan dress is a rare example of ancient clothing that has survived intact. The garment is a precise and verifiable archaeological find. The dress is a key piece of evidence about fashion. The Kadesh Treaty is the oldest known peace treaty that has survived in its original form. The treaty is a specific historical document. The treaty is a key piece of evidence of international diplomacy. The Egyptian maps of the underworld are a specific type of secular map that is used to guide the dead. The maps are a precise diagram of the terrain. The maps are a unique form of evidence. The process of mummification was expensive, and not everyone could afford it. The average person's burial was often a simple pit in the desert. The dry sand would naturally desiccate the body, preserving it in a way that was similar to the artificial process, but required far less expenditure. The natural preservation was a result of the burial environment, rather than a deliberate practice. The cost of the elaborate process meant it was generally reserved for the wealthy or those holding official positions. A model of a house was often placed in tombs, presumably to provide shelter for the deceased in the afterlife. These models were made of wood or clay and depicted the typical domestic architecture of the period, sometimes even including small figures of the family and servants. They were practical representations of the home and were thought to provide a familiar space for the deceased. The models reflect the secular aspects of daily life in ancient Egypt. A specific type of headrest was included in tombs, and this object was similar to the ones used for sleeping in daily life. The headrest was a curved piece of wood or stone that supported the head and kept it elevated while resting. It was a practical object that was also included in the burial goods. The headrest was a standard feature of the tomb furnishings. The canopic jars were made of limestone or pottery, and they were often plain rather than decorated. These jars were used to hold the internal organs removed during the mummification process, and they were placed near the body. The material was a practical choice for holding the organs. The jars could be simple or elaborately decorated, depending on the period and the wealth of the deceased. Jewelry placed in the tomb was not always made of gold. It was often made of faience and carnelian. These materials were used to create colorful beads and amulets that were worn by the deceased. The jewelry was a form of personal adornment that was included for the journey to the afterlife. The materials were more affordable than precious metals, but still visually striking. The Shabti figures were made of various materials, from wood to stone to faience, and they were placed in the tomb to serve the deceased in the afterlife. The Shabti were small figures that could be inscribed with spells to ensure they did the work for the deceased. The material varied depending on the available resources and the period. The figures were a standard part of the burial goods. They left a variety of foods in the tomb, like dried fish, bread, and other provisions, to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. The food was prepared and placed in the tomb as part of the burial rituals. The food was a practical offering for the spirit. The offerings were a common practice. The sandals placed in the tomb were often unused, suggesting they were new and intended for the afterlife. The sandals were made of leather or plant fibers and were a practical necessity for protection from the ground. The presence of new sandals suggests they were provided for the deceased's journey. The practice of placing unused sandals in tombs was common for those who could afford them. They had a specific set of procedures for the burial of animals, which were separate from the human burials. The animals were often mummified and placed in their own tombs or in catacombs. The practice was widespread, and specific rituals were observed for the interment of the sacred creatures. The animal burials were a distinct part of the mortuary tradition. A specific type of resin was used to anoint the body, and this resin was applied to the skin to protect it and to serve as an adhesive for the wrappings. The resin was a natural substance that was harvested from trees and used in the embalming process. The application of the resin was a key step in the preparation. The resin was a standard part of the mummification materials. They often placed a model of a boat in the tomb, and these models were made of wood and could be highly detailed. The boat was a representation of the vessel that would carry the deceased through the afterlife. The models sometimes included figures of the crew. The boat was a standard feature of the tomb equipment. The Shabti were sometimes inscribed with spells that were intended to activate them for labor in the afterlife. The inscriptions on the Shabti were a form of magical text. The figures were a practical tool for the afterlife. The Shabti were a key part of the funerary equipment. The canopic jars were used to hold the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. The jars were a practical solution for organ storage. The organs were preserved separately. The jars were a key part of the mummification process. The headrest was often placed in the tomb as a substitute for a bed. The headrest was a practical object that was also used in daily life. The headrest was a standard item in tomb furniture. The animal burials were often in catacombs dedicated to the specific animals. The practice was a common and widespread phenomenon. The animal burials were a key part of the Egyptian religious landscape. The catacombs were a feature of the cult centers. The resin used for mummification was also used as an adhesive for the wrappings. The resin was a natural substance that was harvested from trees. The resin was a key part of the embalming process. The resin was applied to the wrappings to hold them in place. The boat model was a representation of the vessels used on the Nile. The models were a standard feature of the tomb goods. The boat was a practical object. The boat was a key part of the funerary equipment. The jewelry was often made of faience and carnelian, because these materials were easy to shape and available. The jewelry was a form of personal adornment. The materials were colorful and attractive. The jewelry was a key part of the tomb goods. The food offerings were a standard part of the burial rituals. The food was a practical offering. The food was a key part of the tomb goods. The food was a source of sustenance for the deceased. The unused sandals were a common feature of the tomb goods. The sandals were a practical object. The sandals were a key part of the tomb goods. The sandals were a sign of preparation for the journey. The specific type of stool used by officials was distinct from common chairs, and these stools were often higher and more elaborately decorated with carved legs in the shape of animal feet. The height of the stool indicated the status of the sitter, with higher stools reserved for those of higher rank. The common people sat on low stools or mats. The stool was a marker of social standing. The tables used in Egyptian homes were quite low to the ground, and people would sit on the floor or on low stools to eat at them. The tables were often made of wood and had short legs. The design was practical and suited the climate and customs of the period. The low table was a standard piece of furniture. The bread was baked in specific molds that gave the loaves a distinctive shape, such as a conical form, and the molds were made of pottery. The shape of the bread was a result of the baking process, and the conical loaves were common. The molds were a standard tool in the bakery. The bread was a staple food. A specific term for a household overseer existed, and this person was responsible for managing the daily operations of a large household. The overseer would manage the servants, the supplies, and the maintenance of the house. The role was a key administrative position in wealthy households. The overseer was a trusted manager. A type of lamp made of pottery with a floating wick was used for lighting, and the oil would be poured into the bowl and the wick would float on top. The lamps were a common source of light in homes and workshops. The pottery lamps were simple but effective. The lamp was a standard item in the household. Combs were made of wood or bone, and they were used for grooming the hair. The combs were often finely carved and decorated. The comb was a personal grooming tool. The combs were a common find in tombs. A floor mat made of woven reeds was a common feature in Egyptian homes, and it provided a clean and comfortable surface to sit or sleep on. The mats were made from the papyrus plant or other reeds. The mats were a practical item for the home. The floor covering was a standard household object. Mirrors were made of polished bronze, and they were used for personal grooming. The bronze would be polished to a high shine to provide a reflective surface. The mirrors were an important part of personal care. The mirror was a common item in wealthy households. A specific type of storage jar was used for grain and other goods, and these jars were often large and made of pottery. The jars were essential for storing food and supplies. The jars were a common feature in the household. They used spools for thread, and the thread was wound around a wooden spool for storage and use. The spools were a standard tool for weaving and sewing. The spools were a common item in the household. A specific type of box was used for storing valuable items, and these boxes could be made of wood or other materials. The boxes were often decorated with paint or inlays. The boxes were a secure place for valuables. A basin for washing hands and feet was a common feature in Egyptian households, and the basin was used for personal hygiene. The basin was a practical item for the home. The basin was a standard household object. The stool was often decorated with carvings, and these carvings could be elaborate and depict animals or scenes of daily life. The stool was a functional and decorative object. The stool was an item of furniture. The stool was a standard piece of furniture. The low table was used for dining and other activities, and it was often made from imported wood. The table was a functional item. The table was a common object in the household. The bread molds were made of clay, and they were a specific type of pottery used in baking. The molds were a standard tool for the baker. The molds were used for baking bread. The household overseer was responsible for the operation of the household, and this included managing the staff and the supplies. The overseer was a key figure in the household. The household was a complex operation. The overseer was a trusted official. The pottery lamp was a common source of light, and the oil used was often vegetable oil. The lamp was an essential item. The lamp provided light for the household. The lamp was a standard object. The combs were often found in tombs, suggesting they were important personal items that were included for the afterlife. The combs were a personal item. The combs were a tool for grooming. The reed mats were made from woven reeds, and the mats were a form of floor covering. The mats were a standard household object. The mats were a common feature of the home. The mirror was made from polished bronze, and the mirror was a luxury item. The mirror was a personal item. The mirror was used for grooming. The storage jars were often large and could hold significant quantities of grain or oil. The jars were a practical item. The jars were a common storage solution. The thread spool was a tool used in the production of textiles. The spool was a standard tool. The spool was an item of the craft. The spool was used for holding thread. The storage box was often decorated, and the decoration could include paint or inlays. The box was an item of value. The box was a secure container. The basin was used for washing, and the basin was an item of hygiene. The basin was used for washing hands and feet. The basin was a common item in the home. The Nile had two main branches in the delta, but historical records suggest the number changed over time, with some ancient sources describing as many as 7 distinct channels flowing through the region. The branches were named after the cities they passed, including the Pelusiac, Tanitic, Mendesian, Phatnitic, Sebennytic, Bolbitan, and Canopic branches. Most of these ancient waterways have since silted up or disappeared entirely. The changing river network was a constant feature of the delta landscape. The Mediterranean Sea was known to the Egyptians as Wat Ur, which translates as the Great Green. This name was applied to the marshy papyrus forests of the northern delta, and by extension to the sea beyond. The term was a descriptive label for the body of water. The name was practical and geographical. The Red Sea was known to the Egyptians as the Sea of the Land of Punt, referring to a trade destination to the south. The name reflected the sea's role as a route to the exotic lands that supplied incense, myrrh, and other luxury goods. The Egyptians sailed these waters for trade. The name was a marker of the sea's importance. The first cataract was the traditional southern border of Egypt, a natural boundary formed by a granite outcropping that crossed the Nile. The cataract was a barrier to navigation and a clear demarcation of the Egyptian frontier. The region south of the cataract was considered a different land. The cataract was a geographic landmark. They had a specific name for the valley, Tashimau, meaning the land of reeds, and this term referred to the narrow strip of fertile land in the south. The reeds were a characteristic feature of the landscape, growing along the riverbanks and in the marshes. The name was a descriptive label for the region. The valley was a distinct geographical unit. The delta region was called Ta Mehu, meaning the land of papyrus, which was a fitting name for the marshy, plant-rich area of the north. Papyrus grew in abundance in the delta's waterways, and the plant was a vital resource. The name reflected the defining feature of the region. The delta was a productive agricultural area. They had a specific term for the high desert, which was considered a separate zone from the valley, and the contrast between the desert and the fertile land was a fundamental feature of Egyptian geography. The red land, or Deshret, was the desert beyond the cultivation. The distinction between the black land and the red land was a basic geographical fact. The eastern desert was known for its mines and quarries, and this region between the Nile and the Red Sea was a source of gold, copper, and semi-precious stones. The area was mountainous and difficult to traverse. The expeditions to the eastern desert were a major state enterprise. The desert was a source of wealth. The western desert was known for its oases, which were pockets of green in the dry expanse. The oases provided water and a place to rest for travelers and caravans. The region was the driest part of the Sahara. The oases were essential for desert travel. They had a specific name for the Mediterranean coast, and the coastline was a zone of interaction with the sea. The coast was a line of contact with the wider Mediterranean world. The Egyptians had settlements and ports along the coast. The coast was a strategic region. They had a specific name for the Great Sand Sea, a vast expanse of dunes that lay to the west of the Nile Valley. The Sand Sea was a formidable barrier to travel. The region was largely uninhabited. The Sand Sea was a feature of the Western Desert. They had a specific term for the floodplains, and these lands were the most productive agricultural areas in the country. The floodplains were covered by the annual inundation, which deposited the rich silt that made farming possible. The floodplains were the foundation of the Egyptian economy. The term for the floodplains was a practical word. The eastern desert was also the location of Wadi Hammamat, a dry riverbed that was a major source of stone for statues and building. The wadi was a source of Bechin stone, a gray-green siltstone that was used for making prestige objects. The site was a major source of materials. The wadi was a key part of the Egyptian economy. The Great Green was a descriptive name for the Mediterranean Sea, and the term was also applied to the marshy papyrus forests of the delta. The name was a reference to the color of the vegetation and the sea. The term was a general label for the watery regions. The name was practical and evocative. The Bahr Yusuf was the name of the canal that connected the Nile to the Fayum Depression, and this waterway was a major irrigation feature. The canal carried water from the river to the oasis, allowing for agriculture in the region. The Fayum was a garden in the middle of the desert. The canal was a key engineering achievement. The cataracts of the Nile were barriers to navigation, and they marked the boundaries of the Egyptian state. The cataracts were shallow sections with rocks and boulders. The first cataract was the traditional border. The cataracts were natural obstacles. The Fayum Depression was a natural basin west of the Nile, and it was fed by the Bahr Yusuf Canal. The Fayum was a productive agricultural area that was developed by the Egyptians. The region was a source of grain and other crops. The Fayum was a key part of the economy. The Egyptian name for the Nile was simply Itaru, meaning river, but the river was also called Aur in some texts. The name was a simple and direct label for the life-giving watercourse. The river was the central feature of the landscape. The name was a practical term. The Red Sea was a trade route to the south, and the Egyptian expeditions sailed down its length to reach the land of Punt. The sea was a highway for commerce. The expeditions brought back exotic goods. The sea was a key part of the trade network. The Western Desert was also known as the Libyan Desert, and it was a vast expanse of sand and rock. The region was sparsely inhabited and difficult to cross. The desert was a natural barrier. The region was the driest part of the Sahara. The Nile Delta was a triangular region of marshes and waterways, and it was the most fertile part of Egypt. The delta was heavily populated and agriculturally productive. The region was a source of great wealth. The delta was a key part of the Egyptian landscape. The eastern desert mountains were a source of gold, and the gold was a major factor in the Egyptian economy. The mines were worked for millennia. The gold was a key source of wealth. The mountains were a major mining region. The ancient Egyptians had a type of lute with a long neck and a round body, and this instrument was plucked rather than bowed. The lute was one of several stringed instruments in the Egyptian orchestra, and it was often played by musicians in social settings. The instrument had a skin or wooden soundboard that amplified the strings. The lute was a familiar sound in Egyptian music. They used a type of harp that varied in size, from small enough to be carried to over a meter tall, and these harps were often depicted in tomb scenes. The small harps were sometimes played by women seated on the ground, while larger harps were played standing or with the instrument resting on the shoulder. The harps could have as few as 4 strings or as many as 21. The harp was one of the most important instruments in Egyptian music. They had a type of double flute, usually made of reeds, and this instrument was a common feature of musical ensembles. The double flute had 2 pipes that were played simultaneously, producing a reedy, harmonious sound. The instrument was used in both secular and ceremonial contexts. The double flute was a distinctive sound of Egyptian music. They used a percussion instrument similar to a tambourine, and it was played by men and women alike. The tambourine was a frame drum with a single head, and it was struck with the hand to produce a rhythmic sound. The instrument was used at private banquets and in religious ceremonies. The tambourine provided the beat for dancers and singers. They had a type of drum that was played with the hands, and the drum was a key part of the percussion section of any ensemble. The drum was used to maintain the rhythm of the music and was often played alongside other instruments. The drum was a practical instrument for keeping time. The sound of the drum was a constant feature of Egyptian music. They had a specific term for a female singer, shemayat, and these musicians occupied a high status in society, often performing in temples or for the royal household. The shemayat were professional musicians, and the title was one of prestige. The singers were an integral part of any musical performance. The Shamayat were a key part of the musical tradition. They used clappers made of wood or ivory as a rhythm instrument, and these simple devices were a common accompaniment to music and dance. The clappers would be held in the hands and struck together to produce a sharp, percussive sound. The clappers were a practical way to keep time. The sound of the clappers was a regular feature of Egyptian music. They had a type of lyre with two arms, and the lyre was a stringed instrument that was played by plucking the strings. The lyre was a common instrument in Egypt, and it was introduced from the Near East. The lyre was used in both secular and sacred music. The lyre was a familiar sound in the Egyptian orchestra. They had a specific term for a musical ensemble, and these groups were called kenners, which were attached to specific temples or funerary settings. The kenners were led by a director and performed at ceremonies and festivals. The groups were a regular feature of Egyptian musical life. The kenner was a formal musical institution. They had a type of sistrum, a rattle instrument, and this was an important instrument used in many contexts. The sistrum was a metal frame with rods and metal rings that would jingle when shaken. The instrument was often made of alabaster or other fine materials for use in ceremonies. The sistrum was a distinctive feature of Egyptian music. They had a specific term for a professional dancer, and dancers were often accompanied by musicians in performances at banquets and festivals. The dancers would perform acrobatic feats and rhythmic movements. The dancers were a regular feature of Egyptian entertainment. The dancers were an integral part of the performance. They used a type of oboe-like instrument, and this wind instrument was a common feature of Egyptian music. The oboe was a double reed instrument that produced a penetrating, reedy sound. The instrument was used in both secular and ceremonial contexts. The oboe was a distinctive sound in Egyptian music. The singer chironomist was a unique figure in Old Kingdom musical ensembles, who used hand gestures to direct the singers and instrumentalists. This conductor-like figure would lead the ensemble using specific signs to indicate melody and rhythm. The gestures were a system of non-verbal communication. The clappers were often made in the shape of human arms and hands, and these instruments were a distinctive feature of Egyptian music. The shape was a realistic representation of the hands that would be clapping. The instrument was a practical and symbolic object. The clappers were a regular feature of Egyptian ensembles. The tambourine was a popular instrument for dancing, and the dancers would often accompany themselves on the instrument. The tambourine was easy to play and provided a lively rhythm. The instrument was a regular feature of festive occasions. The tambourine was a key part of the dance. The khaner was a formal musical ensemble that was attached to a specific temple or funerary setting, and it was a key institution in Egyptian musical life. The groups were a regular feature of the Egyptian musical landscape. The khaner was a key part of the performance. The Shamayat were high-status professionals in ancient Egyptian society, and they were often women. The position was one of prestige and was frequently held by members of the elite. The title was an indicator of social standing. The lyre was one of several stringed instruments used in Egypt, and its presence indicates cultural exchange with the Near East. The instrument was a familiar sight in Egyptian art. The lyre was a key part of the orchestra. The clappers were used to keep time for the music, and they were a simple and effective instrument. The clappers were a key part of the ensemble. The clappers provided a sharp, rhythmic accent. The oboe was a double reed instrument, and its distinctive sound was a common feature of Egyptian music. The instrument was a key part of the ensemble. The oboe was a distinctive sound. The khaner was a key institution in Egyptian musical life, and the ensembles were often led by a director. The director was a key figure in the ensemble. The khaner was a formal musical institution. The dancers' movements were often acrobatic, and the dances could involve elaborate steps and poses. The dancers were a key part of the entertainment. The dancers were a key part of the performance. The sistrum was often decorated with carvings of the owner's name, and the instrument was a personal object. The sistrum was a key part of the ensemble. The sistrum was a prized possession. The vizier was the highest official in the land, second only to the king, and he was responsible for the entire administration of the country. This included overseeing the treasury, the judiciary, and all building projects. The vizier was the chief executive, and his decisions affected every aspect of state governance. The position required immense organizational skill and practical knowledge. A specific system of taxation was based on the measurement of land, and the annual assessment of the fields determined the amount owed to the state. The tax was calculated based on the area of land and its productive capacity. The system required a large administrative apparatus to measure the fields and collect the taxes. The taxation system was the foundation of the state's revenue. They used a specific term for a grain storage facility, and these granaries were a central part of the administrative and economic infrastructure. The granaries were essential for managing the food supply and for paying workers. The granaries were often attached to temples or state institutions. The grain was a form of currency as well as food. A census of people and livestock was conducted periodically, and these counts were used for taxation and military conscription. The census would record the number of people and animals in each administrative district. The information was essential for governing the state. The census was a key part of the administrative routine. They used a specific type of seal to authenticate documents, and the seal was a mark of authority and ownership. The seals were made of stone, wood, or metal, and they would be pressed into clay or wax to create an impression. The seal was a guarantee of the document's authenticity. The use of seals was a standard practice in administration. They had a specific term for a tax collector, and these officials were responsible for gathering the revenues due to the state. The tax collectors traveled throughout the country, measuring land and assessing the payments due. The role was a key part of the administrative system. The tax collectors were often unpopular but essential. They used papyrus rolls, not sheets, for official documents, and the rolls could be of varying lengths and widths. The papyrus would be glued together to create a long roll that could be written on. The roll was the standard format for administrative texts. The production of papyrus rolls was a major industry. They had a specific term for a royal archive, and these archives were the repositories of state records and correspondence. The archives stored the records of the administration and were a key part of the state's memory. The archives were essential for the continuity of governance. The archives were a repository of the state's knowledge. They used a specific type of writing, hieratic, for administrative texts, and this script was faster and more practical than the formal hieroglyphs. Hieratic was used for everyday documents, including tax records, contracts, and letters. The script was the standard for administrative writing. Hieratic was a practical tool for the bureaucracy. They had a specific term for a granary account, and these accounts were detailed records of the receipts and disbursements of grain. The accounts tracked the flow of grain through the storage facility. The records were essential for managing the food supply. The grain accounts were a key part of the administrative process. They used a specific type of label for jars, and these labels were attached to the containers to indicate their contents and origin. The labels were often written on pottery shards or bits of papyrus. The labels were essential for managing storage. The labels were a practical administrative tool. They had a specific term for an official dispatch, and these messages were sent by the state to communicate orders and information. The dispatches were carried by messengers who traveled throughout the country. The dispatches were essential for the administration. The messengers were a key part of the communication network. The vizier's duties included hearing cases in the courts, and he was the chief justice of the land. The vizier would settle disputes and issue judgments. The judicial role was a key part of the vizier's responsibilities. The vizier was the ultimate authority in legal matters. The tax assessment was based on the level of the flood, and the inundation would determine the extent of the arable land. The higher the flood, the more land was available for planting. The tax system was adjusted to reflect the annual conditions. The flood was the key variable in the tax assessment. The granaries were often built of mud brick and were designed to keep the grain cool and dry. The construction was practical and functional. The granaries were a key part of the agricultural infrastructure. The grain was a store of wealth. The census records were used for a variety of purposes, from taxation to military recruitment. The information was carefully recorded and maintained. The records were a key part of the state's knowledge. The census was a regular administrative activity. The seals were often made of cylinder shape, and the impression would be rolled across the clay to create a repeating design. The seal was a mark of authority and ownership. The seal was a key part of the administrative process. The seal was a guarantee of authenticity. The tax collectors were known as scribes of the granary, and they had a specific role in the revenue collection process. The tax collectors were essential for the functioning of the state. The scribes were the key figures in the tax collection system. The papyrus rolls were made by gluing together sheets of the plant, and the process was a specialized craft. The roll was the standard format for official documents. The production of papyrus was a major industry. The rolls were a key part of the administrative process. The royal archives were located in the palace, and they were a repository of the state's most important documents. The archives were essential for governance. The archives were a key part of the administrative infrastructure. The archives were a store of the state's memory. Hieratic was used for a wide range of documents, from legal contracts to personal letters. The script was the standard for everyday writing. Hieratic was a practical and flexible script. The script was used by the educated class. The granary accounts were often written in hieratic, and they were detailed and precise records. The accounts were a key part of the administrative process. The granary accounts were a key part of the economy. The accounts were used for managing the state's grain supply. The jar labels were often written on ostraca, and they were a practical solution for identifying and tracking goods. The labels were a key part of the storage system. The labels were a simple but effective administrative tool. The labels were used to manage the storage of goods. The official dispatches were carried by runners or couriers who traveled along established routes. The messengers were a key part of the communication network. The dispatches were a key part of the administrative process. The messengers were a vital link in the chain of command. The vizier's responsibilities also included managing the state's finances and overseeing the treasury. The treasury was a key part of the state's operations. The vizier was responsible for the state's wealth. The vizier was a key figure in the administration. Tomb walls were often decorated with scenes of daily life, and these images depicted fishing, farming, crafting, and other ordinary activities that the deceased wished to continue in the afterlife. The scenes were idealized representations intended to preserve for eternity the activities and people who performed them for the deceased, thus enabling the tomb owner to enjoy the results of the depicted activities. The art was not meant to be a realistic snapshot, but a carefully edited version of reality. The use of color in wall painting followed a standard code, and men were shown with darker skin than women, a practice that reflected their different roles in society. The male skin was typically painted a reddish-brown, while the female skin was a lighter yellow, a distinction that was both convenient for identifying sex and indicative of social habits. The convention was a consistent feature of Egyptian art for thousands of years. They used a specific type of incised line in stone relief, and this carving technique was used in many tombs. The relief could be high or low, and the quality varied depending on the skill of the craftsman. The incised lines were a common feature of tomb walls. The carving was a standard technique. The figures in Egyptian art were typically shown in a composite perspective, with the head in profile but the eye and shoulders frontal. This method showed each body part from its most characteristic angle: the head in profile, the eye and shoulders in front view, and the legs again in profile. It was a deliberate artistic choice, not an error in technique. They often depicted a specific type of offering table, and these tables were a standard element in tomb scenes. The offering table was a practical object that was included in the depictions of the deceased. The table was a common feature of the funerary art. The offering table was a key element of the tomb decorations. They had a specific scale for figures, and the owner of the tomb was usually depicted larger than the servants or other figures, a convention indicating social hierarchy. The larger scale of the owner's image reflected his importance. The scale was a marker of status. The difference in size was a deliberate artistic choice. The style of art evolved over the centuries, and the art of the Old Kingdom is different from that of the New Kingdom. The stylistic changes were gradual but significant. The art of each period had its own characteristics. The evolution of style is a key part of Egyptian art history. They had a specific type of paint base for wall paintings, and the paint was applied to dry plaster, a technique known as distemper. The paint was mixed with a binder and applied to the surface after the plaster had set. The technique was a standard practice in Egyptian painting. They often depicted specific types of boats in the tomb art, and these vessels were shown in scenes of travel and transportation. The boats were a common feature of the landscape. The boats were a key element in many tomb scenes. The vessels were essential for travel. They had a specific type of border design around tomb scenes, and these borders framed the images and added to the decoration. The borders were a standard feature of the composition. The borders were a decorative element. The borders were a regular feature of tomb art. The term for a sculptor was stantui, and the sculptor was a skilled craftsman. The sculptors were a key part of the artistic community. The term for the sculptor was a professional label. The sculptor was a key figure in Egyptian art. They used a grid system for laying out figures, and this system ensured that the proportions of the figures were consistent. The grids were created using lines and squares. The grid was a tool for the artist. The system helped maintain the canon of proportions. The scenes of daily life on tomb walls were largely allegorical and idealized, and they were intended to provide for the deceased in the afterlife. The images were a form of provision for the spirit. The scenes were a standard part of the funerary equipment. The art was a practical and symbolic offering. The artists worked in teams, with different specialists responsible for the various stages of the process, from sketching to carving to painting. The division of labor was a key feature of the artistic workshops. The process was a collaborative effort. The teams were a key part of the artistic industry. The reliefs were often painted, and the colors were vibrant and carefully chosen for their symbolic meaning. The paint was applied after the carving was complete. The colors were a key part of the final image. The paintings were a standard part of the decoration. The composite perspective was a distinctive feature of Egyptian art, and it was used to create an idealized representation of the human figure. The technique was a deliberate artistic convention. The perspective was a key feature of Egyptian art. The style was consistent for thousands of years. The term for a painter was a specific professional designation. The painters were a key part of the artistic community. The painters were responsible for applying the colors. The painter was a key figure in Egyptian art. The offering table was a central feature of many tomb scenes, and it was a symbol of the provisions the deceased would need. The table was a practical item in the art. The offering table was a key element of the funerary art. The table was a symbol of provision. The canon of proportions was a set of rules that governed the representation of the human figure. The canon was developed over centuries. The rules were a key part of the artistic tradition. The canon ensured consistency in representation. The Egyptian artists did not use perspective in the modern sense, and their work was a form of symbolic representation rather than realistic depiction. The art was a form of expression. The style was a deliberate artistic choice. The artists were not concerned with realism. And so, quietly, we arrive at the last of it. A final measurement, a final number, a final small and utterly useless detail. The ancient Egyptians had a specific unit of measurement for the amount of water a man could carry on his head in a single trip from the river to the fields. It was called the henu, and it was roughly equivalent to 2.5 liters. The exact volume varied depending on the size of the jar, but the unit was a practical standard for organizing irrigation work. That is the kind of detail that has survived. Not the grand proclamations, not the sweeping narratives, but the small, precise, almost boring facts about how people actually lived. The henu was a measurement that mattered to the farmers, to the administrators, to the people who needed to move water from one place to another. It was a fact that was useful at the time and is almost entirely irrelevant now. If you remember nothing from the hours that have passed, that is entirely the point. The brain has been given the softest of workouts, the gentlest of distractions. The mind has been allowed to wander, to drift, to unhook from the concerns of the day. That is the only purpose of this exercise. The ancient Egyptians had a word for the moment just before dawn, when the sky begins to lighten but the sun has not yet appeared. It was a small, precise term that captured a fleeting moment of transition. The word is no longer in use, and it has been replaced by other words in other languages. The moment itself continues to occur every day, unnoticed by most. The henu was a measurement of water carried on the head. The journey from the river to the field was repeated countless times by countless people. The water was poured into the furrows, and the crops grew, and the cycle continued. The measurement was a practical detail of daily life, and now the measurement is just a fact. A small, precise, almost boring detail that has no relevance to the listener lying in the dark. That is the point. The fact is there, and it is true, and it requires nothing from you. Sleep well, knowing that the only thing you have truly accomplished is letting time pass. The facts have been delivered, and they have faded. The henu was 2.5 liters. The sky darkened, and the stars appeared, and the night continued. The measurement no longer matters. The night is quiet. The brain is at rest. Good night.